It is said that the eyes are the window to the soul, but what if the soul that looks back isn't as human as you first thought? These 7 captivating and unique love stories shine a spotlight on otherkin, people who identify as being something other than human. From non-human mythical creatures to ravens, coyotes, cats, and dogs, each tale is a fresh and exciting window into the otherkin subculture. Go on a journey where love isn't always where you thought to find it, or who you thought to find it in. Forward. Good Morning is the end of traditional romance novels. We publish only the best and most unique love stories that cover the spectrum of sexualities and cultures indiscriminately. We seek out the best independent voices and artists to provide a wide variety of literature to our readers at as close to printing costs as possible, while still financially supporting our authors and cover artists. When we decided to release an anthology featuring otherkin characters, it was extremely important to us that the stories represent real-world depictions. Shifting Hearts is a compilation of true-to-life romantic tales that people can find themselves relating and connect with. Even if the reader has no ties with the otherkin community, even if the reader has never heard of the otherkin community, we'd like to thank all of the wonderfully talented authors and our long-suffering editing staff for knocking this project out of the park. Also, a special thanks to the artist whose beautiful work add a whole new dimension to these stories. To those who can identify to anything within these pages, we dedicate this book to you. Enjoy. Indeed They Cry by Lauren Brownless. My dreams are always about flying over the ocean, a stretch of water so calm and so untouched that everything could float away, but so delicate that even the quietest intake of breath could shatter it. The wind, barely more than a ripple across my cheeks, pricks my eyes in painful flickers. I'll drop my head against the wind, looking down into the ocean. Below, shimmering across the surface of the water, is the reflection of a cramorant in flight. I'll watch the raven in the water, fighting the desire to call out, to speak with the raven about life, death, togetherness, to be the raven's friend. When I finally call out, the raven will ignore me, so I'll glide on in loneliness, closing my eyes and breathe in. The air will slide over my face, calm at first, then heavier and stronger, and I'll realize too late that I'm falling, propelled through the air by momentum. Alone. The ocean will speed towards me. I'll wave my arms around me, trying to carry myself, hoping to achieve flight. I'll call out for the raven, call out for help, but nothing will come. The sky will rush between my fingers, my descent will quicken, but the raven is gone, and that isolation will always hurt harder than my headfirst crash into the water. I wake too quickly, warm and sweating, trapped underneath tangled sheets and the weight of arms around me. Instinctively, I move my hand up to touch the arm, his arm, resting across my torso. The cuddle is a comfort to my human body, but a threat to my avian mind. I clutch into his arm, talons angle to dig in should any danger present itself. He shifts lightly in his sleep, and I relax my hand. Still caught up in the dream, the avian threats relent to the human comforts. I sigh and look away. Around my familiar bedroom, a dim orange glow sits on the windowsill, restrained by the drawn curtains. Birdsong drifts in behind the light, muffled by layers of glass and fabric. I close my eyes and see a nest. I shuffle, ruffle my feathers. The bed frame creaks. The tree branch wobbles in the breeze. I roll my head across the pillow and around the perimeter of my nest. Something sharp pricks my temple. I lean away from it and continue turning my head as far as I can, straining my eyes to see. A small feather is poking through the pillowcase. Carefully, I lift his arm off of me. I sit up and let his arm fall back across my lap. I run my hand across the pillow to find the feather, pushing the surface with my fingertips. Once found, I grip the shaft and gently tug it out. The feather is unremarkable, white and fluffy like all the others. Beside me, he stirs. I turn to him and watch his breathing, shallow, rhythmic, sleeping. I run the feather over his cheek, and down his chin, across his lips. He doesn't flinch. I brush the feather over his eyelid, over the other, down the bridge of his nose. His eyelids flutter restlessly, but he doesn't move. I try to fight the smile that grows across my lips. I lean towards him and rest my cheek near his forehead, his hair brushing against my neck, and nuzzled quietly. The birds outside still sing their mornings, and I have to remind myself that singing with them is never quite as satisfying as it seems to be. He, with his arm around me, doesn't know why I sing. He doesn't know why I like high places. He doesn't know why I'm so sensitive in the mornings, why I get so territorial. He doesn't know that I am lonely, that he can never satisfy that twittering part of me that calls itself a sea raven. I lift the hand that holds the feather and release my grip. It falls into my palm and rests there for a few moments. Then I lift my head and blow. My breath catches and lifts it into the emptiness of the room, where it drifts lightly in front of me. It is white, but I see black feathers. It floats freely, but I feel caged. He is too human, but I love him. I love him with all my human heart, but I resent him with all my avian anger. Before the feather can land by the edge of the bed, I wriggle away from him, kicking the sheets off and pushing his arm back towards him. I sidle out of the cage and hop a few paces as I gain my balance, lifting my heels off the floor to stretch my arms over my head. I push down against the rug, soft and grassy between my toes. My wrists bend into a flex, and I pull myself upwards at the stretch of my fingertips. It's difficult not to imagine sitting atop my nest, stretching out my wings. With a shake of my head, I curl my fingers into my palms, lowering myself onto my heels and bringing my arms to my sides. I look back at the bed and see his human shape. Think of his human mind. He doesn't know. I wrinkle my nose and walk slowly to the window to peek through the blinds. Songbirds hop across the grass, feeling the vibrations. A raven waits on the fence post, watching the ground. It looks like the one in my dreams. I sigh and look back to the bed. My own nest, my own mate. I touch my hand to my lower stomach and hope for my own brood. Before I can start crying, I turn away and head towards the bathroom. With no clothes to remove, I step straight into the shower and open the tap, letting the cold water rinse away those feelings of loneliness and flight. Like him, showers are too human, but unlike him, they comfort me when I'm feeling displaced. When birdsong and cuddles start to feel threatening, when his human and my raven feel too unnatural, when everything feels like drowning, sopping wet feathers weighing me down. The sharp jets of water bring me back to my body. The water falls across my skin where feathers would protest against it, easily sliding over my shoulders and down my arms. The evening threats fall dormant to the human comforts. I sigh as I close the taps. The last few drops dribble onto my shoulder, and the flow stops completely. The change is quiet. My comfort doesn't soar into my arms or crash into me. My concerns just rinse away. No longer alone in this human body, I wrap a towel around me and head into the bedroom, walking with as little noise as possible across the creaky floorboards, leaving a trail of water droplets behind me. I make it to the bed and roll into it. I rub the towel through my hair to soak up the excess water, and then rest the towel across his upper body, barely containing a giggle. He stirs, stretches, and reaches up to move the towel off his face, mumbling my name. I let out a low, high whistle in answer, which quickly dissolves into untamed giggles. He half-heartedly throws the towel over my head, and as I reach for it, I feel his weight push me back into the pillows. The towel slips off my head, and he leans towards me. Our noses an inch away from touching. I can feel his breath on my lips. I reach up to peck him on the cheek, then settle back down into the blankets. My mattress soaks up the water from my skin, and as his forehead brushes against my own, I can feel myself floating into an ocean. Raining Cats and Dogs by Elizabeth Coppin. Iris hung her arms bonelessly over the edge of their bunk bed and thought once again how proud she and Lorelei had been to purchase a double over-desk pine bunk bed, despite the slight difficulty of finding one. Said difficulty had evaporated delightfully in the bedroom section of IKEA earlier that year. Iris adored the lofty high space, the smell of sealed wood, and the room to curl away from Lorelei's body heat in the summer. Lorelei delighted in the smell and space, but had a thin, faint approval for the height. There she drew on the arboreal human instincts, which didn't quite run so close to the skin as Iris's margay. Iris shifted about on the wide wooden board that separated her from the tumbling onto the floor, and glanced down to see Lorelei's wide gray eyes peering out from under the bed. The rain purred through the murky glass of the window, and Iris smiled shyly behind the pine board. Lorelei wrinkled her nose and batted those dark, deep, drowned eyelashes round her gray eyes, tipped her head to the right, and her thick, almost artful curls of gunmetal blonde hair tipped with her. "Thought you had an essay to polish, Puss," Lorelei barked up at her. Her voice was a cracked glass high, but she slid over the words like a small child, hopping rock to rock across a glassy pond. Iris grinned through wispy black and purple bangs, licked her lips, and tasted raspberry lip balm. "And I thought you offered to do it for me, gorgeous dart." Lorelei passed up a thin bundle of crispy printed paper, ring-bound and snap neat. Ing. Iris popped the pet name like a lollipop from her lips. "Sweetness, honey, baby doll, quit it." Lorelei bared her teeth in friendly canine grin, the smile lulling from between her bite. "Sugar," Iris purred to a finish. "Scoot over." Lorelei wheeled the office chair back. Sitting up to lean over the board, Iris curled over it in a smooth movement before dropping inelegantly to the fluffy rug below the bed. Shook out her inky ponytail before sitting up and placing her hands directly on Lorelei's lap. She gazed up at Lorelei, bored. "I know you wanted to go out, but..." Light brown eyes flicked over to the window. "I hate rain." "I know. Pretty British Chinese cat lady person." Lorelei rubbed the pad of her thumb by Iris's ear, skimming her scaffold piercing that whispered trouble to strangers on the street. Almost as much as trouble as the cheery pink stud in Iris's nose and flash of purple in her bright bangs. At best, her smooth tea-colored skin said foreigner, despite Iris being second-generation English, as though it was impossible to imagine English as anything other than white. Lorelei grinned cheekily at the thought. On the other hand, Lorelei, with her pristine ash-blonde hair curling to the middle of her back, angular features, and porcelain skin, whispered Aryan Ice Queen with each step down the crowded street. Flash of purple hair, pink stud, and barbell earring. Trouble was not the first thing Lorelei noticed with Iris. Milky, get-out-of-my-country skin would have been the last thing Lorelei had spotted about Iris in a crowded lecture hall. Lorelei had been born in Czechoslovakia, and every word that poured from her mouth mumbled the same thing Iris's roommate did about her. Foreigner. Still, Iris's mincing digigrade step was noticed before that. That odd brand of wariness and certainty was noticed before that. The way, when she was royally pissed off, she curled her lips back to reveal bright teeth stood out more. A startled wilding of a cat peeking out between purple and black bangs was far more noticeable than any possible mundane trouble. "I love you, bohemian wild dog," Iris hummed, snuggling into Lorelei's lap. "We'll go out tomorrow, after you finish work." Iris considered herself to be mostly margay, with 2 huge chunks replaced by human. Sometimes she wondered who she would have been in the right skin. It had been furred and with flexible wrists and daring rosette patterns, and decided she would have been nothing extraordinary. She would have been any old margay instead of a slapdash human. She still greatly preferred the internet and the barbell piercings to the idea of the wild, a short, brutal existence. But there are things blood deep that bring loneliness at having lived differently to your fate. Iris felt as though she had been a river dammed and denied the ocean, And who cares if that is the only way you know yourself, because you are spliced apart and left uneven. Lorelei, again, on the other hand, was a human doll, a natural hybrid. She wasn't learnt human. Too much of it sprang from her nature. Her ability to appreciate heights had nothing to do with how she had been raised. Where Iris was wary and certain of what she was, Lorelei pondered and wondered and mulled over it. Whenever her reaction to fear was to growl, she thought herself less than human, but whenever her reaction was to cry, she thought herself mad forever, believing she was less than human. "And you, Spotty Cat," Lorelei kissed Iris's forehead, brushing the silky bangs away to reveal soft skin. "Tomorrow. Cool." Iris batted Lorelei away until her fringe fell back in front of her eyes. She gave Lorelei an offended, affectionate, confused smile. At first they had circled one another as wild animals, even though their humanities had quickly bonded over whether or not the Jabberwocky could be considered modernist or postmodern in retrospect. Within the tutorial classroom, they were considered friendly. They debated like beasts. Slowly, debate and instinctive guardedness gave way to genuine friendship. The animal parts of them, the slight gleam of teeth in Iris's mouth, and that porcelain bark of Lorelei's voice, highlighted to the other that here was someone to be trusted, someone who understood things that weren't fully human. It had been rainy when finally Lorelei confessed how non-human she could be sometimes. Tutorial had been cancelled, but the regularly scheduled debate could not be missed, because Iris smelled like raspberries if you were close enough, and Lorelei's voice could break glass. The rain murmured against the window pane like a cat scratching and begging to be let in. The debate had cracked into uneasy talk of childhoods. What was Iris to say of that? She had spent her childhood climbing trees in the schoolyard and hissing down at people. She spent most of it in trouble, and the rest of it with a profound dislike of everybody. So Lorelei said of her childhood that she felt like some kind of werewolf, sometimes human and sometimes not. Iris held her tongue. "How dare you?" Lorelei snarled at Iris, gray eyes turning a pale green as blood rushed into her face. "I've just told you my dearest secret," Iris countered, teeth bared. 6 months after I told you the same thing," Lorelei started to cry and furiously rubbed at her eyes. She was far too human to be dealing with this wild cat. "How dare you leave me wondering if you think I am mad? It's not the same thing. You left me wondering whether or not I was crazy or imagining things. You must understand." Lorelei brushed at her eyes again. "How could you possibly doubt whether or not you're a Theron?" Iris snapped, crossing her arms over her chest. "Theron," Lorelei breathed, eyes lighting up. "There's a word?" "Yes, of course," Iris shrugged. "Didn't you look online?" Lorelei looked down at her feet, now crying openly. "How would I have known where to look?" She took a shivering gasp of air. "How could I not doubt that I was insane? How could I not think something was wrong with me? I growl in anger. I bite, and whenever I look at pictures of a doll, I can hear it whistling and cooing inside my brain. I don't feel as human as I think I should. But how should I know how human being human feels?" Gray eyes squeezed closed. "How can you lead me to these thoughts?" Iris stalked back and forth, and finally, in agitation, wrapped her arms around the nearest tree and rested there against the scratchy bark. Looking up, Lorelei's stomach dropped. She could feel imaginary phantom ears dropping against her nape, the low swing of a non-existent tail, and a half-hearted whine sitting on her sternum. Daring her just to start whining, so some fantasy of a school child could pull her hair and tell her, "You're not an animal, you bad dog." Lorelei turned about, sobbing past the whimpering against her chest, and began to heavily stagger away. "I'm sorry, okay?" Iris had unwound from the tree and come sprinting after Lorelei, knocking her to the floor with Iris's weight. They thrashed on the floor bleakly, Lorelei snapping at Iris, and Iris hissed, hand cupped like a paw. They froze. "I'm so sorry. I've always been a Margay," Iris muttered, swallowing back a growl. "I don't know what it's like to doubt everything I feel." She paused, eyes wide at Lorelei, and then licked the bite mark on her wrist, as the first sign of rain dripped against her face. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know it wasn't the same at all." Iris and Lorelei curled up in a heap on their bunk bed, yawning, with odd purrs and human hums of contentment. It was the perfect early summer temperature, not so cold they curled up under thick blankets, but where neither growled at the other for touching them in the sticky heat. Iris lazily reached past to brush Lorelei's face. "Remember how we got together, Lai?" Lorelei stretched lightly, rolling about on her back and snuggling closer. "It was raining. You hate rain." Iris curled her face into Lorelei's neck. "I hate rain," she agreed, yawned. "You laughed at me. If you had fur, it would have been bristled. It would have been static, all on end." Lorelei's lips quirked at the thought. A car sped past. "You were drenched." "I like to get soaked on my own schedule. I had an umbrella." "Stupid ladybird pattern thing." Iris gave a half laugh. "You kissed me by the kebab shop on the road." "We had chips," Lorelei giggled. England was a rainy place. Its rain had a tendency to wait for you to get just over halfway to wherever you were going before leaping out of the crowd shrieking "Gotcha!" and leaving you with no choice but to continue walking as it turned dials and pressed buttons that read hail and wind so strong the droplets hit you horizontally. As soon as you get inside, it begins clawing at the door, whining like a dog or cat left out in the rain. It could be soft and demanding, or can caterwaul outside. You shake off your coat and splay it over the radiator. You slip out of your shoes, stuff them with newspaper. You peel your socks off and lay them over the radiator pipes in your entrance hall, and the smell of warmed wet socks begins to burn in the air. Still, even bundled in a clean, dry jumper and blankets, the rain taps at the window, slips through the grass outside. How the world spins on, so surely, so gently, inexorbitantly. 465 meters, 930 meters, 1,095 meters. Even then, the rain slides down the window pane and asks to be let in. Iris squeezes herself against Lorelei's thick, soaked coat, pulls it from her shoulders, even as it drips all over her, sits Lorelei down, unties her shoelaces, and yanks those off as gently but effectively as she can. The muddy water pools in her fingers, and she slips Lorelei's socks off, tips her head up as Lorelei bends down to kiss her, so ajar in the mouth, off-center, lips to corner, corner to center, an uneven kiss. "I love you." Iris presses their mouths together evenly. Looking the Real You in the Eyes by Chris Witham. Marla tried to remind herself of the phrase fiesta lente, hurry slowly. If you try to speed up beyond your capacity to pay attention, you start making mistakes and end up going slower rather than faster. No matter how rushed you are, you need to keep within your limits. Otherwise, your attempts to save time will end up costing you time. That's what she tried to tell herself, but time was ticking down. He'd be here soon, and she wasn't ready. And if it wasn't today, then when? Her parents would be back by day's end, and who knew when she'd be able to get enough time to work. It was impossible to get anything done with the two of them about the house, and almost as impossible to get them out of the house. If their anniversary hadn't been a big one, she didn't know if she would have ever gotten the 2 weeks that she did. Even for that, she had to practically pry them out of the house. She shook her head. She couldn't think of this sort of thing. She had work to do, hinges to secure, wires to measure and cut. And then there were She looked at her watch. Don't think about that. He was coming, and she had to be ready in time. It had been hard enough to get him to agree to come over. Why hadn't she pushed back the meet time another hour? If all else failed, she could probably use one of the prototypes, but she worked so hard on getting this one right. She adjusted the springs. She'd found the invariant points under every possible configuration and run the wires through them to avoid unintentional movements. She fit it all into a PVC frame, which was lighter than the prototype 2, and stronger than Prototype 1. She just had to get the damn thing back together and sealed. It shouldn't be this hard. She'd measured thrice and cut and drilled whatever once. But why in the hell is it taking such force to put it back together? Almost there, the screwdriver slipped, and before she could stop it, she had cut a gash in her right forearm. It was like how they'd met. She'd seen him in this class or that from time to time, but never really taken much notice. She never took much notice of anyone who wasn't in her way. Too much to do, too little time. She'd vaguely been aware that he'd sometimes be looking like he wanted to say something but never did. Then this past year, when they were both on the robotics team, they still didn't really get much contact because they were working on different parts of the robot. She worked on the drive mechanism, he worked on the frame, and neither of them was involved in coordinating between the two teams. And one day, just like today, she let a screwdriver slip, as she was putting more force into it than, strictly speaking, wise or necessary. It opened a cut deeper than the current one in her right arm. She didn't cry out. She wasn't much into dealing with pain like that. She did lick her wound, and sort of suck on it to stop it from dripping everywhere. "You're a vampire?" he had asked. She was surprised. She hadn't noticed him approach, and thought she was alone. She stopped sucking on the wound, wrapped it in her shirt, applied pressure, and managed to, "What?" Well, she processed the words. A beat later, she said, "I only drink my own blood." He looked at her arm, wrapped in her shirt, and said, "Your shirt's dirty, grease and oil. You shouldn't use it as a bandage." She looked down and said, "Crap," as she realized he was right. When she unwrapped her arm, he said, "Here, let me." Set the medkit on the workbench, popped it open, and removed antiseptic wipes. She looked across the room to where the medkit was kept, then to where he had been working. Then she tensed in pain. "Hurts?" he asked. "Incredibly much." "Well, at least it's clean." He put a gauze pad on the wound. "Pressure." She pressed on it while he looked through the kit for something to wrap it with. How did I what? How did you realize I was injured and get here with the medkit so fast? Would you believe I have this entire place wired with a sophisticated surveillance system that notifies me the instant anything of note happens? No. Would you believe a half-rate surveillance? Would you believe that I've seen Get Smart too? How about 2 cops in a rowboat? She tried not to laugh. Seriously. She looked down at her now bandaged arm. "You must have started moving as soon as I got cut." He looked away, as if the carpet to his left had suddenly become very interesting. Well, what? "Well, I was looking over here anyway, hoping for a chance to break the ice with you. Did you consider coming over and saying hi?" He turned his attention back to her. "Hey, how are you? You look like you're really busy, so I'm just going to intrude on your time because I think it's better spent speaking to me and..." "Okay, point taken, but the ice is broken. Or at least the skin. Not funny." "Yeah," he looked away again. "My sense of humor kinda sucks." "What did you want to say once the ice was broken?" He looked back to her again. He tried to start speaking a couple times, but no sound came out. Then he said, "That I think you're pretty, and I like that you're not the only one who thought a Vandor motor was named after the German inventor." I knew I wasn't the only one. Rather than a part of the van, it moved when I first heard it spoken, and we seem to have a bunch of the same interests, so maybe we should hang out sometime? She nodded along and then asked, "Do you like America?" "For the most part, yes." "We are talking the country or the band?" "The band. They're giving a free concert." "I know, but I'm a pedestrian and I can't get anyone to drive me up." "I can drive you." And that was how it all started. Maybe being in the same situation was some kind of a sign. She shook the thought from her head. She was hoping for romance, but at the moment she had to be pragmatic, not romantic. There was work to do. She cut her right arm with a screwdriver again, because she held tools in her left hand, so any damage from slipping would be done to the hand or arm holding the thing being worked on, the right one. It was a screwdriver because they tend to slash, where wrenches tend to leave bruises but not break the skin. This was no time to make romantic illusions out of injuries. She was behind schedule. She moved to the bathroom, keeping pressure on her arm. She'd already licked the room clean of any offending particles by the time she'd gotten to the medicine cabinet behind the sink. but she still poured some disinfectant on it. Then she slapped on a sterile pad and secured it with an ace bandage, and headed back to her work table. She repeated to herself, "Fiesta lente," and got back to work. By the time all the wires and springs were secured inside their PVC casings, it became clear she was going to have to improvise. There wasn't enough time to finish, in spite of her earlier projection that she should have been done hours ago. It was becoming evident that even if she had asked him, her, if she couldn't get that right, then maybe Cale was right. Maybe it wouldn't work out. No more pronouns, she decided. From now on, it's always Cale. That triggered another surge of memories. As the relationship developed, they had never actually used each other's names, just you this and you that. So it was actually after they'd been, well, she was never sure if it was dating or just hanging out because she never did much of either. Cale hadn't either. Whatever it was, they'd been doing it for a while before Marla learned Cale's name. And when she first learned it, which was by seeing it written, she'd mispronounced it badly. Looking back, Marla didn't even understand how she'd gotten it so very wrong. It seemed a straightforward name now that she knew how to say it. But Cale had teased Marla, playfully of course, and Marla decided to have some fun at Cale's expense. When Cale said the name, Marla said it back wrong. When Cale said, "like the cabbage," Marla asked, "what cabbage?" They spent quite a while going back and forth, with Marla saying increasingly bad mispronunciations of Cale. Finally, Cale said, "like Dale with a C. We're from the same place. We have the same accent. How can this be hard for you?" At which point, Marla burst out laughing. "Oh, so not funny," Cale had said. "Whatever you say," Marla said, trying not to laugh. "Sail." Then Cale tried not to laugh and tried for an angry voice as he said, "a hard C," but they both ended up laughing together. Again, she shook the memory from her head. She had work to do. She was going to have to butcher some of the prototypes to make the ready-made parts and save herself the trouble of making them anew for the final version. But first she had to check that the frame worked. Testing would be easier if she were the same size as Cale, but Marla wasn't, so the harness to which the frame was attached had to be adjustable, as did all the control mechanisms. She wouldn't know exactly how long any of the wires had to be until she had everything on Cale, and that was assuming Cale went along with it. She considered other, less physical control mechanisms, but ultimately decided against them. She wanted direct physical connection, muscle to movement, even if it wasn't the right muscle, because the right muscle didn't exist. It would at least made it feel more like a frame was a part of oneself, and that was the whole point. So she did probably was the quickest product testing ever, and then got to moving the remaining parts from the prototypes to the final version. Cale wasn't sure what to expect. Even in her own mind, she had to keep reminding herself that she wasn't a he, given how much of a step forward it had been to admit it to herself, regardless of what her anatomy might say, that she was a she. It was important not to step back from that revelation, but then it seemed just as much time was spent not saying such things out loud. That was the lesser of her secrets. She'd gotten too close to Marla and had to pull away because she couldn't believe that someone like Marla could love a freak like herself, and it was easier to end it there and then than it was to wait for the inevitable collapse. When Marla asked for a reason, Cale found that she couldn't lie to Marla, and told her things Cale had previously only half admitted to herself. And when Marla said it was okay, she still loved Cale, Cale couldn't believe it and went away. But Marla had looked so hurt and broken that when she begged Cale to come over just one last time, Cale couldn't turn her down. Cale had no idea what she was planning for the visit. Cale took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. Then, when the answer wasn't immediate, she considered running away. Being alone was the safest place to be, where Cale belonged. She could recognize that she was a freak. Marla would too sooner or later, and it would be hurt all the more if they stayed together until that point. Too late. Marla opened the door. She was wearing stained jeans, pink tank top, and a light jacket as stained as her jeans. Some of the stains Cale could recognize: grease and oil from robotics, thermostat plastic spilled onto her, and turned from liquid to solid only after seeping through the knit of her clothing. Sawdust that had been rubbed in so thoroughly it had become part of the clothing. Other stains Cale had no idea about. The tank top, on the other hand, was immaculate. A darker pink, closer to strawberry than stomach medicine. It was something Marla knew Cale liked seeing her in. Something kept safely stored away when she was working on her projects. The tank top might mean she was trying to get them back together, given that that was the most likely possibility anyway. Cale was ready to run away. She just needed an excuse. So why am I here anyway? Cale asked. We are going to play dress-up. Cale had not been prepared for that. Can't you tell? I'm in a costume already. What costume? I'm going to dress up as myself. You are going to dress up as yourself. Cale walked away. Marla ran to catch up, and then she started walking backwards so they could talk face to face. Cale sped up. Marla said, I can walk backwards as fast as you can walk forward, and if you run, I might get hurt, so just hear me out, okay? Cale stopped. Fine. Okay, I hear you. Go. Marla took a moment to collect her thoughts. Cale did her best to look impatient, crossing her arms and glaring. When Marla was ready, she looked around. In public? Sure, why not? Look, please try not to be angry. It's just that, when you told me that you were really a girl on the inside, you thought I'd hate you and want to leave. But I didn't. And I told you I loved you, and you didn't believe me. When you told me that you weren't human either, I tried to tell you I still love you, but you didn't believe me. So what I propose is this. You dress up as yourself, your true self. Not what you present to the world, but who you really are. That way I can look at the real you, look at you straight in the eyes, and tell you I love you. And if you still don't believe me, then I give up. I'll leave you alone. But I've spent a fair amount of time and money, not to mention blood, sweat, and tears on this, so at least give it a try. There was dead silence between them. Please, Marla added. After a short pause, Cale asked, Tears? Mostly sweat, and on the next on the list is probably blood, but there were definitely tears. How much blood? Marla pulled her right arm out of her coat sleeve to reveal the hastily bandaged wound, as well as a few band-aided fingers. Good God, what did you do to yourself? Cale asked, looking at her arm. It's much worse than it... Strike that. Reverse it. It looks much worse than it is. I was in a hurry, so there's actually way more bandage than the wound called for. For a time, they just stood. Now, will you come inside? Marla asked. Cale nodded and started walking back towards her house. Cale had followed as Marla led the way into her bathroom, which was fairly large. Marla explained that it was for the mirror, so Cale could get a look at herself once she was fully dressed. Before they got to the point, there was a matter of undressing. Cale took off her coat, a blue hoodie she had come to love, without any objection. But when Marla asked her to take off her shirt, Cale gave some pushback. Come on, it's not like I haven't seen you topless before, Marla said. When? Cale asked. The last time we were both at the beach? Don't tell me you've forgotten. I remember. You wore a green bikini, so it's okay for you to check me out, but not for me to check you out? I didn't say that. Shirt off. Cale sighed and removed her shirt. The sight in the mirror was just another sign that, whether her soul might tell her, her body and the world at large thought she was male, and at least she kept clean-shaven and had gotten some length to her hair. A couple of times she had even been called ma'am. Okay, Marla said. Now I'm going to get you dressed, but I don't want you to look until I'm done. Think you can handle that? Or should we have done this in another room and then only come into one with the mirror after it was done? I can handle it. Good. Eyes closed. Shoulders down. Why would my shoulders... Shoulders down. Cale closed her eyes and let her shoulders droop. Marla left the room and quickly returned. Cale felt the strangest sensation on her chest. She snuck a look and couldn't stop herself from exclaiming, I have breasts! They were designed to be realistic on a naked body. Instead, the breast forms were meant to be worn under clothes. Cale was pretty sure she recognized the brand. Marla said, Somebody speaking. Sorry, eyes closed. How did you... I told you, a fair amount of time and money. I've looked into it myself, and they're not exactly cheap. Well, they're imperfect, so they came with a discount and still not cheap, and I think you're worth spending money on. Kale felt some kind of strap being secured around her chest, slightly below her new breasts, then similar things being secured around her shoulders and neck. You do know I'm not into bondage, right? Kale asked, then quickly added, I don't think there's anything wrong with it, but so if it's your thing, I mean, no offense, but I'm not exactly into it. I share your lack of prejudice and lack of interest, Marla said. What I'm doing has the same purpose as a belt. It's going to keep things in place, not restrict your movements. And, what are you doing? I told you, no peeking until it's done. I'm not peeking, I'm asking. Which is just peeking with words instead of eyes. That makes no sense. It makes perfect sense. It makes some sense in a metaphoric kind of way, but it's hardly. Bend your right elbow, Marla said, laying a finger on it. Kale bent her elbow. No, not there, Marla said. She moved her finger. Maybe there? Bend it again. Kale did. Yep, there. Something was strapped to Kale's right elbow. The process was repeated for her left elbow and her shoulders, though in the case of her shoulders, existing things were adjusted rather than strapped on. Then Marla slid thick, leather-feeling gloves onto Kale's hands. They took up half her forearm and were strapped into place. So I have gauntlets now? Kale asked. They're not gauntlets, Marla said, and this would be over by now if you didn't keep interrupting and fidgeting. Kale hadn't noticed any. I'd been fidgeting? Like a fidget meister at a fidget fest, Marla said, as she secured something onto Kale's back, and now the point of several of the straps Marla attached to Kale's earlier became apparent because they functioned like a complicated backpack, distributing the weight and holding whatever it was in place. Now, Marla said, all done with that part. Let's get you dressed. Remember, eyes closed, shoulders down. She rummaged through something behind Kale and then came around to her front. Put your arms forward a bit. Kale did as she was told and felt something slide into her arms, finally recognizing it as a bra. I said, shoulders down. Kayla hadn't realized her shoulders were up, but complied. Marla walked behind her to secure the bra. After she did, there was more rummaging. Seriously, how hard is it to keep your shoulders down? Kale put her shoulders down. Marla walked around her again, arms forward. What followed was one of the most difficult experiences of putting on a t-shirt Kale had ever experienced. You know, if I could see what I was, shoulders down. Again, Kale hadn't noticed she raised her shoulders. Again, she was forced her shoulders down. Marla walked around her again, and Kale heard two zippers. You know, Kale said, I know you said this isn't some bondage thing, but you've tightened straps all over me, and there are zippers in weird places, and there's leather involved, and I'm not allowed to see what's fake leather. What? Fake leather. I can honestly say I have no idea what it's made of. Probably gives us both cancer. Kale responded with a flat, yay. Now look, you're less than a minute from me telling you to open your eyes, but there'll be a couple more zippers involved. Think you can handle it? Go for it. Okay, arms back. Kale felt what seemed to be a familiar garment being pulled up on her arms. My coat. Not exactly, Marla said, putting the hood on Kale's head. Then Kale heard two more zippers. They started where the coat's normal zipper stopped and ended somewhere on Kale's back. Yeah, my coat doesn't have zippers there. Open your eyes. Kale didn't know what to say, think, or do. The woman in the mirror was exactly what she wanted to be. A woman. An angel. White feathered wings extended from her back. Though she looked like a woman where Kale usually did not, and she looked like an angel where Kale usually did not, she was still clearly Kale. The angel in the mirror was wearing what looked very much like Kale's favorite t-shirt, a plain red shirt. The angel wore what looked very much like Kale's favorite coat, but the blue hoodie was still lying on the counter in front of her. Part of Kale had never been so happy, but another part was devastated because it was all fake. Fake breasts, fake wings, fake angel, fake woman. She could see what was supposed to be in the mirror, but she knew how far she was from supposed to be in reality. So? Marla asked. So what? Kale said, trying to bring out the devastation and hide the happy part. Don't pretend to be unhappy when you're not. You're not good at it. Kale really was mostly unhappy, but she'd apparently failed to hide the happy part. All you've done is stick a couple of fake wings. Good song. What? Fake wings is a good song. What are you talking about? Oh, that anime. That anime, Marla confirmed. Can't you stick to the point? Now you're quoting Dr. Strangelove. Marla noticed how flustered Kale was getting. Sorry, she looked guiltily at her feet, then back up. She was still behind Kale, so their eyes meeting had to be done via the mirror. I truly am sorry. What is the point? Kale sighed. You're forgiven. But the point is this. All you've done is stuck a couple of fake wings on me. That doesn't make me the real me any more than the runway models of fake angel wings are. All this is fake. It's a lie. Marla said sadly, I'm sorry you feel that way. I'm not a geneticist. I can't make you sprout wings, but I did my best. Could you at least try them out before you give up? What? Shoulders up. Kale lifted her shoulders, and the wings, which had been folded behind her back, straightened out to their full wingspan. Kale's eyes went wide. So, Marla said, now that you see why I needed your shoulders down to get around you, they stood in silence for a bit. Then Marla said, lift your shoulders as high as they go, strain them forward towards the sky. Kale did, and the wings lifted from horizontal to higher and higher. Stop, Marla ordered. You hit the ceiling. Kale lowered her shoulders to a normal height, and the wings went horizontal. It's not the first time I had a problem with the size of this room. The first prototype I built out of balsa wood, light and easy to work with, but it sort of tore itself apart. So the second one I built for strength, but I didn't pay attention to how big I was making it, so it did not fit in this room at all. And both of those could only go from rest to horizontal. For the third prototype, I tested an entirely different system of controlling the movements. More wire, less rods, more complicated, but also allowed me to put in more features. Am I boring you? Kale shook her head. No. Well, let's get back to this version anyway. Roll your shoulders forward. What? You know, like you're worried something's going to hit you in the face? She mimed protecting her face by crossing her arms in front of her. Kale did the same thing and found in addition to her arms in front of her face, she had wings there too. How? Kale asked. Well, Marla said, a wing is basically an arm. Rotate your forearm, and your hand can point in the opposite direction. On a wing, the hand is the largest part, so what else can I do? Shoulders back. Kale did so, and the wings went back too, the right one hitting Marla. Not that far back. Kale giggled. Marla asked, aren't you wondering what the controls in your hands do? Kale hadn't been there. I am now. Stick out your thumb. What? Marla reached her right arm in front of Kale to demonstrate. Give me a thumbs up. That's a thumb sideways. Whatever. Kale did, and a group of feathers near her wrist joint stood up. Did you know that birds have thumbs? Marla asked. Because I didn't. They're called alula. Singular alula. I figure if birds have them, and angels have bird wings, and you're an angel, then you must have thumbs on your wings. And what better way to control a thumb than with a thumb? And all of these other wires on my hands? Okay, wings horizontal. Kale complied. Now bend a wrist back. Kale bent her right wrist as instructed, and the forearm of her right wing went vertical. The outermost and innermost segments remained horizontal. I figure, Marla said, that if we don't have our wrists and elbows constantly being locked into the same angle as our shoulders, you shouldn't either. Speaking of, twisting your wrist left or right, Kale discovered the movements controlled how the outermost part of the wing worked. And that basically covers it, Marla said. You can't have your wings back, and the forearm rotated 90 degrees because it would require you to put your shoulders back and forward at the same time. Other than that, go wild. What about these wires on my fingers? Right, those. They serve no practical purpose. I just figured if the forearm could twist the, aft arm, rear arm, hind arm, upper arm, Marla. Right, the upper arm should be able to twist too. So you make a fist, Kale did. You'll see that the upper arm can twist. What I haven't figured out is why you'd want to do it. Kale lowered her shoulders, folding her wings behind her. Marla turned around. Kale said, Thank you. Yeah, Marla said. Her voice didn't seem very enthused. Kale spun around to face her, and Marla turned back to face Kale. I'm serious. Thank you. Marla faced what was on the dresser behind her. I got you a skirt and I figured that you didn't want to be bottomless in front of me. She handed Kale a bundle, which is made of an orange ankle-length skirt and a pair of panties. How do you feel about it? You being half naked on the bottom? She smirked. I'd feel fine if I were. I think I'd feel all nervous and awkward. She started towards the door. Look, I'll be waiting in the backyard. It's fenced in, so no one will see you but us. If the person in the mirror starts to look like the real you, come out and meet me. Marla waited nervously outside. Kale had been warmed to the wings, but that didn't mean she'd warmed to the idea of getting back together. A month of pre-planning, 2 weeks of work with little in the way of sleep, 6 prototypes, and those were just the ones successful enough to get numbers. It was all in hopes of getting Kale back. Sure, if Kale could live a happier, more fulfilled life with her new additions, that was something, and Marla would be able to get some comfort from it. The one constant in the relationship, from when she thought Kale was the boy she loved, to when she thought Kale was the girl she loved, to when she found out Kale was the female angel in a male human body she loved, was that she loved Kale. Could she live without Kale? Sure, she could live without a lot of things. Did she want to live without Kale? She'd rather live without her good arm. Maybe it wouldn't last forever. The odds were against first love being final love. What mattered to her was she loved Kale, and whatever the future might actually hold, she had no intention of stopping loving Kale. Kale, who had left her for fear she couldn't love a freak. Beautiful Kale, who didn't seem capable of understanding she wasn't a freak. Kale, who didn't seem to understand that even if Kale were a freak, which she wasn't, Marla would still love her. She was also the same Kale who was taking a damn long time to come out to the backyard. Finally, after it seemed like forever, the back door opened. Into the yard nervously walked a radiant beauty. An angel in an orange skirt, red t-shirt, and unzipped blue hoodie. Marla had given up trying to figure out her sexuality. She wouldn't have considered the possibility that she was a lesbian or even bisexual before Kale told Marla her true gender. Now she couldn't conceive of not considering the nervous young woman in front of her hot. And she wasn't interested in anyone else, male or female. When they were a few feet away from each other, Marla asked, Am I looking at the real you? Well, there are a few things here and there. I know white's too bland a color for the wings, Marla said quickly. I was going to dye them, but I was running seriously low on time, and I can make modifications. But yes. Okay. Marla took a deep breath. She stepped closer. Okay, real Kale. She inhaled again and looked Kale in the eyes. I love you. There was half a moment's pause. And you're not a freak. I love you too. When Kale's arms wrapped around Marla, her wings did too. A sensation Marla was sure she could get used to. She returned the hug, then initiated the kissing. Like Calls to Like by Esther Day. Every person Joss has ever met had some degree of self-importance. From an egomaniac to the humblest, at some point there is no denying the human disposition of believing in an inflated sense of self-worth. After all, who should be the center of a universe if not oneself? Joss had never particularly felt important or special. He was an average poor kid who grew up to be an average poor guy. Working in service only cemented his worldview of being a fading wallflower in the theater of his own life. There's no quicker way to feel invisible and redundant than earning a paycheck as a shy waiter. He worked in a Waffle House, where people who usually didn't make any more money than he did came to eat the cheap food and had no interest in idle chit-chat or fake smiles. It was actually safest for his tips if he was as unintrusive as possible, appearing and disappearing as soon as possible. Being quiet by nature made Joss used to being overlooked. It was the way he liked it, really. It was what he'd come to expect. It was a Tuesday afternoon in May when everything changed for Josh. He was sitting in the dimly lit break room beside the kitchen when an unfamiliar young man wearing the kitchen staff's apron came in. His features were appealingly striking, his body lean and muscled, and the edges of brightly inked tattoos peeked from under his sleeves. In summary, he was gorgeous, at least in Josh's opinion. Gorgeous people did not notice him, which he was glad for, or else he'd have to remember how to do silly things like form sentences in their presence. Hey, the new guy said, then actually seemed to follow the polite rules of society and didn't immediately ignore Josh. Instead, he waited, tilting his head slightly, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Hi. If Josh's voice had been a heart monitor, he'd be coding. I'm Alex. He was going to ask a favor. Josh was suddenly sure. He needed to borrow his phone or catch a ride after work. Well, joke was on Alex then. Josh's phone battery was dead, and he took the bus. For some reason, his miserable excuse of an existence made him feel triumphant just then. Josh. Awesome. This is my third day of work. I thought I'd met everybody already. Alex sat across from Josh at the wobbly break table, turning the equally balanced challenge chair to sit on it backwards, arm folded over the back. I work nights. Josh sounded reluctant, even to himself. People sometimes joked that he spoke like each word physically pained him. The truth was that it kind of did. That explains it. So tell me, is Ruth always like a general losing a battle in the kitchen? 'Cause damn, just damn, I haven't been ordered around like that since never. Granted, I think I was working faster, but that's really besides the point. Josh tried not to, but he smiled. Ruth really was a terror in the kitchen. A spatula her sidearm, the deep fryer the hole she condemned contrary kitchen staff to. Alex smiled in return. It was an easy, fluid quirk of his mouth that lit up his face while his eyes danced. Josh felt his stomach swoop and cramp simultaneously, and knew then and there that he was screwed. Alex kept on talking, going on about what he'd learned and who he'd met in the 3 days he'd been in the kitchen, and Josh hung on every word, while uttering a few of his own as possible. Josh had friends. Okay, he had 2 friends. The same friends he'd had since he was 7. He understood how that worked. He had fallen into the groove of familiar friendship, and everything was smooth and easy. He met the guys before they had all their adult teeth, so there wasn't much they all didn't know, accept and understand about one another. What Josh didn't understand was how Alex turned into a friend. One day, he had no clue who Alex was. The next, the guy showed up talking and just didn't stop. His voice was a constant on breaks, when they shared shifts, making jokes, and telling stories until the sound of him speaking over the distant chatter of pots and pans was expected, welcome, and comforting. Josh even joined in, tried out his rusty sense of dry humor, and Alex always beams and laughed like Christmas had come early. They picked up conversations that had days spanning between them, like no time had passed, and it was easy. Seeing Alex straddling his chair, leaning forward so his chest pressed against the back, with hands gesturing wildly and eyes alight from within, was the highlight of Josh's day. The truth was, while Josh had 2 friends, now 3, he had little else. He worked constantly because the need for mundane things like food, rent money, and medicine wasn't going anywhere. When he wasn't at the restaurant, he was working under the table at the car wash down the street, or holed up in the studio apartment putting together tiny little motherboards for what he assumed was the going rate for child labor in Thailand. Josh had been diagnosed with diabetes at the age of 16, which meant at 22, with no real skill set, he was financially hurting in a way his aimless peers weren't. He applied for better paying jobs all the time, but until something more worthwhile came along, Josh got by. But getting by, dragging himself from one poorly paid job to another, wore him down and isolated him in a way only workaholics could be. 3 weeks after meeting Alex, the novelty of having him as a work friend hadn't worn off, but Josh was worn out. One minute Josh had been eating all the overly buttered vegetables and potatoes he'd gotten from the kitchen, while listening to Alex go on about the movie he'd seen the night before with his roommates. The next it was quiet, and Josh's cheek was mashed into something bony and warm. Josh mumbled a confused noise, prying heavy eyes open to realize that Alex had moved to sit beside him at the table, so Josh could lean against his shoulder while he slept. "What happened?" Josh asked, voice rough, and he blinked gummy eyes hard as he sat up. Immediately he missed Alex's warmth. Josh's whole body ached in a way that had nothing to do with napping in an awkward sitting position. Loneliness, it seemed, could feel like any other ailment. He He hadn't really touched anyone, platonically or otherwise, in a long time. The urge to slump back down and nuzzle against Alex, to press his warmth and get lost in the feeling and scent of him was almost overwhelming. You fell asleep. I was just about to wake you up. Our break is almost over. We looked at one another, Alex full of his good humor, and Josh sleep-stupid with no clue what was on his face. For a second he was lost. Did he thank Alex, or was it easier to ignore his kindness? Then his brain caught up with Alex's words, and Josh was up like a starting pistol had gone off. The weight of his insulin kit was heavy in his pocket, and the whole way to the bathroom. He could not afford to get sick, not even a little bit. It wasn't until Josh had capped and trashed his syringe that he'd realized he'd left Alex without a word. It seemed ignoring that intimate moment was the way to go then. Sunday nights were always the most boring shifts. People tended to stay home, hoarding the last few hours of their weekend behind closed doors. It also made catching the bus that much harder, since there were fewer people out and about, it usually running on time, and Josh usually didn't. When he'd mentioned it absently to Alex while they shared dinner in the break room, he was surprised by Alex insisting he could drive Josh home that night, and wouldn't take no for an answer. That was how Josh found himself at 10:30 standing in the kitchen, outright staring at Alex while he cleaned the last of the cutlery. As a rule, none of the waitstaff spent a lot of time loitering in the kitchen. For one, no one had tips for them in there, and two, there wasn't much room to spare to tuck oneself out of the way. Josh wasn't finding that last part very trying, as Alex had to repeatedly brush past as he cleaned and straightened. At one point, Alex rested a hand on Josh's shoulder and leaned across him to set a container on the counter behind them. That was how Josh got his first good look at the tattoo on Alex's bicep. "It's a dragon," he said dumbly, and Alex stopped mid-stretch to stare, their faces so close their noses almost touched. "What?" Alex asked, his eyes inexplicably round. "Your tattoo. It's a dragon." Josh was blushing. He could feel the heat rising up his neck and stain his cheeks. He wasn't sure if he was embarrassed by how idiotic he must have sounded, befuddled over Alex's closeness, or both. "Oh, yeah." Alex finally stepped back and pulled up his sleeve. A traditional Chinese dragon curled around his arm, its serpentine spine a vivid red, its jaw open in a brutal-looking snarl. "This one is too," Alex said, and started unbuttoning his shirt. Josh had to grab hold of the counter behind him and hoped it wasn't obvious that his heart rate had ratcheted up at the sight of Alex undressing. Alex stopped midway and pulled his collar aside to reveal another tattoo inked over his heart. This one was a stylized dragon in black, its body elegantly twisted, its wings graceful and powerful-looking arches. All Josh wanted to do was press his lips to Alex's skin and see if it tasted different from his unmarked flesh. "Awesome," Josh got out, borrowing one of Alex's favorite words. Alex grinned. "Yeah, like calls to like, you know?" "You're not a dragon," Josh said plainly, even as something childlike recoiled inside him from the villainous imagery dragons preoccupied in his mind. Too many kids' movies, he presumed. "Sure I am," Alex said matter-of-factly, buttoning his shirt back up with downcast eyes. "No," Josh insisted. He couldn't reconcile Alex, kind, cheerful Alex, with the image of a ravaging creature with acidic drool and bloody claws. "You're not evil. You don't hoard treasure or breathe fire, man." Alex laughed, and for the first time ever, the sound wasn't a happy burst. It was a weary, tired edge that Josh didn't understand. "I'm glad you don't think I'm evil, but I have my dickish moments, and I hoard things I think are important." His tone was serious, and Josh had no clue how they deviated to this place, comparing mythical creature to Alex's character with such gravity. "We all do," Josh said quickly, wanting to reassure Alex somehow. "Almost done in there, guys?" Georgette, the night manager, asked on her way to lock the night's earnings in the safe. "Sure," Alex said, blowing up the towel he'd been cleaning with and throwing it like a basketball into the bin by the door, his easy smile back when he made the shot. "What are you still doing here, Joshua?" Georgette called from the door. "You'll miss your bus, sweetie." Josh hated being called by his full name more than he did sweetie, but Diner Life had taught him anyone who poured someone else's coffee inevitably got dubbed with incredulous nicknames. "I'm giving him a ride." Alex raised his voice to answer for him. "Yeah?" Mike, a new part-timer working his way through school, stuck his head into the kitchen. "Can you give me one too? My sister's running late to picking me up." Instead of an immediate, good-natured agreement, like Josh expected, Alex stared blankly at Mike for a moment. "Where do you live?" he finally asked, sounding non-committal. "Off Pine and 3rd. That's in the totally wrong direction for us, man." Alex shrugged. Worth a shot." Mike disappeared again. Josh looked at Alex, who seemed to smile reflectively. "Ready?" Josh nodded, not trusting his voice. It was stupid, but Alex giving him a ride when he wouldn't to another coworker made him feel special. Important, maybe. He hadn't felt that way in a long time, and it warmed him so that when Alex smiled at him as they climbed into the beat-up car, Josh was helpless to do anything but smile back. Josh had never been camping before. He had an idealized image in his head of Boy Scouts making fire with sticks and peering over cliff faces to name exotic birds. Again, it was probably too many kids' movies to blame for that. All in all, he'd never given much thought to pitching a tent somewhere. He was a city kid, and the one vacation he could remember his mom taking him on to a water park was hazy but happy memory. None of this explained why he immediately agrees to go on a camping trip with Alex and his friends, almost before Alex could finish inviting him. Maybe because it would be nice to get away, or maybe because he wanted to give that whole nature thing a try, or maybe he should own up and admit to himself how far gone he was for Alex. He could have been asking for a kidney and Josh would have agreed before having to think about it, so long as they could share a recovery room. He'd been friends with Alex for 2 months when Josh found himself standing in the dirt, squinting at all the open space around him and feeling oddly claustrophobic. His skin itched a little, like it wasn't used to this much unfiltered sunlight all at once. It was so quiet, Josh found himself resisting the urge to tilt his head like he needed to drain water from his ears. There was no hum of electricity, no background noise of humanity thumping and trudging along beside him in his apartment building or at the restaurant. There was only the sound of the wind through the leaves, the buzz of insects, and... "Why are you frowning?" Alex asked, laughter in his voice as he got the last tent pole snapped into place. "It's weird," Josh shrugged, trying not to feel self-conscious, and failing when Alex's friends, Heather, Emma, and Johnny, all turned to look at him. "What is?" Emma asked, her face open and ready to share whatever the joke was. "Nature," Josh said, and everyone laughed. Josh couldn't help but frown again when he shifted his weight and felt the give of the soil under his sneakers. He never knew he could miss asphalt before. He was just starting to consider wandering out of their camping spot into the paved road they'd driven in on. Maybe he'd adjust better if he took this whole camping thing in baby steps, when Alex's arm wrapped around his shoulders. "Weird isn't bad, man. This is going to be so much fun. You'll see." Alex was grinning right at him, and Josh felt his lips echo the look out of reflex. "If it's so bad, I'll let you borrow my phone and you can watch the bad TV I have downloaded, while you try and sleep in one of the cars," Heather offered as she and Johnny finished storing food in the wooden cabinet that stood behind the well-worn fire pit. "He's not going to sleep in the car," Alex said, like Heather was suggesting Josh strip naked and go in search of Bigfoot, because that was ridiculous, right? Bigfoot wasn't a thing. Josh was pretty sure. He glanced around at the trees again and realized bears really were a thing, even if yetis weren't. The others were talking amongst themselves when Alex leaned close. "Nothing's going to jump out at us," he reassured in a low tone. And Josh impulsively leaned into Alex's solid presence at his side. Alex smirked and squeezed his shoulder tight before letting go. "Let's have fun," he announced, and dragged them all off into the uncharted territory that was the campground wilderness. The thing was, after Josh forgot to feel out of place around all the foliage, he found he was having fun. Alex was all smiles and boundless energy as he led them all down dirt paths and over rocks and fallen trees. Alex was always a buoyant, happy force in whatever room he was in. Without walls to contain him, he became a beacon of joy. His exuberance was catching, and Josh felt like a kid, ready to dig his fingers into something and marvel at any new discoveries. Josh and Alex wandered away from the others when the girls got preoccupied with taking pictures. Alex followed a tiny trail overgrown with weeds that he easily traversed, and the rich smell of growth and pollen was strong in his wake. They found a small cave hidden amongst an outcropping of rocks, and Alex disappeared inside, while Josh more carefully picked his way to the entrance. He found Alex standing in the darkness several yards into the cave. His eyes were closed as he breathed in the cool air. With a heavy weight of rock above them and surprisingly appealing smell of damp earth around them, Josh watched Alex relax and realized he'd never seen his friend more at home. Josh had also never been more drawn to him. That night there was indeed a campfire, though Emma used a lighter and old Cosmo pages to start it, and not twigs and ingenuity. They'd roasted hot dogs over the flames, more for the fun of it than the desire to eat them. Josh was having a great time, and so long as he didn't look into the night where the darkness swallowing the surroundings so completely it was kinda spooky, he couldn't remember ever having a better time. Josh was listening to Heather explain the merits of thrift store shoes when a rustling across the fire had him looking up. Alex had hiked to the campground background and was back. Firelight danced across Alex as he moved with a fluid grace out of the undergrowth behind their tents. The slight breeze had the smoke from the fire curling around Alex as he approached. Emma had danced away from the soot when she'd wandered into the path before, but not Alex. The haze embraced him, and he only seemed happier for it, smiling as he caught Josh looking. The heat of the flames distorted the air between them, and for a moment it looked like Alex was exhaling a plume of smoke. Dragon, Josh's brain whispered. The thought came out of left field, sending him back to the night he'd seen Alex's tattoos. True, Alex didn't look anything like the artwork decorating his body, but suddenly the comparison wasn't nearly as confusing or unappealing. Being quiet by nature meant Josh ended up not talking about a lot of things. It wasn't intentional. He didn't mean to keep things about himself secret. Usually nothing seemed worth remarking on if someone else was perfectly happy carrying the conversation. Josh hadn't even realized he'd kept his diabetes a secret. He practically ate all of his meals around Alex, but when Alex ducked into their tent and found Josh with a flashlight under his chin as he capped his insulin syringe, they both froze. An odd, forced quirk to Alex's mouth made Josh realize he'd never seen that look directed at him before, and felt unexplainably touched. Alex had never made sense, not the way he'd automatically taken to Josh, or how he'd seemed to occupy a special place in Alex's regard. He didn't go out of his way to buddy up to the other coworkers, and the whole day with Alex's friend he'd stuck close to Josh, making sure he got all the inside jokes, while Alex didn't explain their own. Alex especially didn't make sense just then. He twitched the tent door closed behind him, like he was shielding Josh from being seen by anyone else. "What's going on? Sharing is caring, man," Alex tried to joke, but his face wasn't used to doing anything disingenuous, so it didn't translate well. It took Josh a moment to realize what conclusions Alex must have drawn, and actually burst out laughing. "It's insulin. I'm diabetic," Josh explained, still huffing with amusement as he watched Alex relax. Oh, that's why you go off to the bathroom after eating." "What?" Josh asked, shoving his medical supply back into the little pouch he always kept in his pocket. "I thought you either had embarrassing bladder issues or you were bulimic. You really?" Alex shrugged before his eyes went round. "You just ate like 3 marshmallows. What the hell? Are you going to be okay?" Alex's serious worry had Josh ducking to hide his pleased smile. It'd been a while since anyone had really worried about him. Alex made him feel special, and Josh had no idea what to do about it. Reassuring Alex about marshmallows not sending him into a diabetic coma morphed into Josh getting interrogated about other things he hadn't told Alex. Eventually they settled into their sleeping bags, lying close to share the foam pad Alex had unrolled on the floor of the tent. "Ever break any bones?" Alex yawned around the question. "Ankle. I was 5 and tripped coming down the steps out of our building. The sad thing was, I was only 3 steps to the ground." Josh smiled at the memory, remembering how worried his mom had been, and how she'd held him just as tightly in the ER waiting room as she had that night, rocking him to sleep in a way she hadn't since he had been far younger. She had scolded him when he tried to blame himself and apologize. Even at 5, he'd had no illusions about money and how they didn't have an excess of it. She scolded him and held him all night, pressing kisses into his hair until he fell asleep. It was well into the night, but nearly a full moon provided more light than Josh would have guessed. He could see Alex lying on his stomach, curled slightly towards Josh. His breathing was evening out, expression relaxing in a way it hadn't since the whole interrogation had started. Josh slid his hand across the mat, curling his fingers to rest just beside Alex's arm, where his body heat was like a brand. Josh wanted to touch, but he couldn't bridge the gap. He felt inexplicably brave for the small movement he'd made. Very soon, he found his own eyes drifting shut. The last coherent thought that filtered through his brain was to wonder if Alex didn't like to press his back against things. He slept on his stomach, sat in every chair backwards, and sometimes sat forward while he drove like he was overeager to get there. For some reason, Josh's sleepy brain connected those dots but couldn't take them to a conclusion before he was dreaming. Josh and Alex had been friends for almost 5 months when Georgette pulled Josh into the break room and pointed to Alex, who was sitting with his face pressed into the table. "Take him home," was all she said, a touch of concern in her voice. Alex let out a weak groan, and Josh was beside him in seconds. "What's wrong?" "I think it's the flu. Seriously, take him home, please. Mike's already out with this bug. We really don't need it spreading around," Georgette said before marching out of the room. Josh's shift was just about over, so he wasn't going to be out any money. Even if he would have been, he still would have dropped everything to take care of Alex. Since that cramping trip, they had been hanging out a lot more outside of work. It hadn't done anything to mute Josh's attraction, but he wasn't overly concerned about that. Alex let out a pitiful and congested-sounding groan when Josh grabbed his arm to help him stand. "Keys?" Josh asked, and Alex handed them over without comment. Josh didn't drive much, so he blamed his hypervigilance while he drove Alex home on his lack of experience and not how worried and protective he felt. Emma and Johnny weren't home, so the apartment they all shared was quiet when Josh got them inside. He'd become pretty familiar with the layout of the place and easily got Alex into bed and brought him Gatorade from the fridge and pain meds from the cabinet in the bathroom. Almost without thinking, Josh plugged Alex's phone in to charge. Alex got super worried about having a dead battery. Alex lay on his stomach, his face pale and eyes glazed. "Thanks, man," he mumbled. Josh nodded and barely resisted the urge to say, "Any time." No matter how fond Josh was of Alex, they were very definitely just friends, maybe even best friends. "I'm going to hang out for a bit, shamelessly watch daytime TV. Yell if you need something," Josh said, and Alex pressed his face into his pillow, but not before Josh saw the smile. He flapped a hand at Josh, which he took as permission to take over his couch. When Josh checked on him after 3 episodes of I Love Lucy, Alex had added sweat and coughing into the mix. "How are you feeling?" Josh asked helplessly. "Awful. Even my tail hurts," Alex rasped. Josh blinked before pressing the back of his hand to Alex's forehead. He had a fever, but he wasn't that warm. Not hallucination warm. Perplexed, Josh impulsively swept his hand above Alex's ass, fingers cleanly swiping through the air where he assumed any tail Alex might have had would live. He didn't feel a thing, but Alex twitched, huffing out a pained sigh. Josh snatched his hand back and looked over his shoulder guiltily, like there was someone there to witness whatever this was. "I'm going to get you some more medicine," he announced, and hurried out of the room, feeling like he'd done something wrong and more confused than he could have ever remembered being. After that, Alex mostly slept, and Josh didn't disturb him again. Josh wasn't used to stifling the urge to talk, but just then he had a million questions and no one to bounce them off of. Ridiculously, Josh thought if he gave voice to these weird occurrences he was only now puzzling out, they'd make some sort of sense. Stewing his confused thoughts certainly wasn't going to bring anything to light. When Emma came through the door, shoes in hand and a tired but welcome smile thrown in his direction, Josh couldn't stay quiet any longer. "Alex is sick," Josh said, and snapped his mouth shut out of reflex, feeling like a dam was breaking just behind his teeth and wasn't sure it would be less destructive to allow it or fight it. He'd hung out with Emma plenty, but he didn't know her like he knew Alex. Didn't know if he was about to betray something or someone in his need to make sense of Alex claiming to have a tail. Yeah, he was feeling bad last night. I think he got it from Johnny. "He's just getting over a bug," Emma said as she dropped all her stuff on the counter and stuck her head in the refrigerator. Josh leaned forward on the couch to watch her, debated for half a second before the dam broke, and words burst out of him without his permission. "Yeah, he's... I don't know, he's out of it, and he said something about having a tail? Emma's spine went stiff. She took a few moments too long to look at him to make her reaction anything close to casual. Oh yeah? Yeah, what's that about? Emma shrugged, but she looked anything but confused. You should ask him. They stared at one another for a long moment, and Josh hated the silence in a way he rarely ever did. I will, he said eventually, and Emma smiled, like he said exactly the right thing. Good. You hungry? I was going to order pizza. Josh nodded and leaned back on the couch. He'd let the dam break, let the need to have answers wash out his normally timid nature, and he found himself more out to sea than ever. 3 days later, Alex was back to work and acting like everything was normal. That was Josh's fault, though. First, he'd waited for Alex to be healthy and to have the talk he'd promised Emma, and then he realized he didn't have any clue how to bring it up. Alex took Josh's awkward silence for the normal garden variety kind and easily carried the conversation during their shared dinner break. It wasn't until Alex was giving him a ride home after work, sitting forward in the driver's seat and leaning over the steering wheel, that Josh opened his mouth. Why do you do that? He asked, apropos of nothing, and Alex gave him a questioning look. Can you pull over? Josh felt like he had to move, to fidget, to get away maybe. For 3 days his mind had been like a skipping record, repeating Alex's words, cycling through odd memories, an endless spiral of confusion with no conclusion in sight. Are you all right? Alex asked, pulling into the empty library parking lot. The building was dark, save for a few security lights, and the old park beside it had only one working lamppost. The playground equipment was thrown into stark shadows, creating alien shapes. It reminded Josh of camping, huddling close to the fire against the night, an animal instinct buried deep inside that had been fearful of things he couldn't see. Alex had stepped out of that darkness like he belonged to it. He looked ethereal and unreal, and the wonderful kind of dangerous. Josh had felt like he was really seeing Alex for the first time. For as open as Alex was, and easy as he was with his words and his kindness, there was an unexpected savage quality Josh had glimpsed that night, and he had been hungry to understand since. Josh got out of the car, started towards the brightest source of light on instinct, and stopped abruptly when he didn't hear Alex following. He stood by the car, hidden in the long shadow Josh's body made. They stared at one another, and Josh watched worry flood Alex's expression, though for once he had nothing to say. You said you have a tail, Josh blurted. The few yards between them felt like miles, like he was shouting someone's secrets across a chasm and waiting to hear if they echoed back, sounding just as strange as he thought they would. Alex visibly startled, and they stared at each other while Josh's heart pulsed rapidly and his palms started to sweat. When Alex moved, he was slow about it, cautious, like he was trying not to spook Josh. It was too late for that, Josh thought, but didn't budge as Alex carefully erased the distance between them. Have you heard of otherkin before? Josh shook his head. Otherkin are people who have a soul, or, some say, share a soul that isn't human. This soul, it can be an animal or even a mythical creature, things long gone from this earth, or that have never existed outside of an ethereal plane. That's what I am, Alex explained in a calm tone that reflected his earlier cautious approach. Josh didn't have words. He had no clue what to even begin to say while he processed all the new information, and the silence must have worried Alex, because he went on in a rush. I don't talk about it because it's hard to explain, but it's who I am. It fits. It's who I am when I dream and how I see myself just under my skin. I said something about a tail when I was sick and out of it, right? I'm sorry. That must have been weird. I know this is. I wouldn't have chosen to tell you that way. I wanted to tell you, but I was terrified you'd call me crazy and then not want to ever speak to me again, and then Josh kissed him because he still hadn't found the words, but he finally understood what had been happening for the last 5 months, and he didn't need to speak to react to that. There was no reason for Alex to be terrified about anything unless he cared as deeply as Josh did for him. For a horrible moment, Alex was frozen and unresponsive, and Josh thought he had got it wrong, that he'd misheard or hurriedly jumped to wanted conclusions, but then Alex cupped his jaw and deepened the kiss. Josh clung to Alex and shuddered happily when Alex licked into his mouth. The embrace was primal heat and unchecked want, and Josh was lost in it. Josh had never felt very special or remarkable, but Alex was. He was fun and happiness and just otherworldly apparently. Alex was right. It did fit. Alex made sense in a way no one else did, no one else could, and Josh never wanted to let him go. All too soon, Alex pulled back, and they panted at one another. Josh had no idea what his expression was saying, but Alex looked like a mix between concussed and wondrous. "Dragon?" Josh asked, realizing Alex hadn't said it that night, but he had before. Josh slid his hand from Alex's shoulder to rest over his heart, where he knew the tattoo of a black serpentine dragon was inked to his skin. "Yeah, dragonkin," Alex agreed. "You're not... This is..." Josh didn't know exactly what Alex was trying to articulate, but he answered anyway. "Yes," he said, quietly. He was pretty sure when it came to Alex, his answer would always be yes. "I'll have questions. I just can't think right now. With you, so yes," Josh breathed against Alex's lips. And they were kissing again. Lying in Alex's bed hours later after Josh had discovered for himself that Alex's tattoos taste just the same as his ink-free skin, but before the sun had come up, Josh found himself smiling. He was tucked against Alex's side, their legs tangled together, and Alex smiled back. "What color are your scales?" Josh asked sleepily. "A gray-blue," Alex said quietly, fingers tracing idle patterns on Josh's back that made him shiver. Josh had thought up questions and got a few of them between the pressing need to kiss and touch Alex. He'd learned that Alex had always felt different, that even as a child he had known he was something other. He'd apparently declared he was a dragon at the age of 3, rather out of the blue, or so Alex's mom had told him, and proceeded to make sheet and blanket caves to sleep in until his parents bribed him out of it. Also, to Josh's surprise, his dragon didn't breathe fire or have poisonous talons. "So, the cave thing, that's true," Josh stated, rather than having to ask. He'd seen that one for himself. "Yes," Alex agreed. "What about hoarding treasure?" Alex didn't have excessive collections, nor had Josh seen any pack rat tendencies, or at least none that were blown out of proportion that would land him on a reality TV show. Alex snorted in amusement. "I shove money under the mattress. It's my version of curling up on a pile of gold." "Really?" "No." Alex grinned, for it turned a little sly. "I might start keeping things I treasure on top of the mattress, though," Alex whispered and kissed Josh, and it was a hungry, possessive caress. "Yeah, okay, I could get behind that," Josh gasped when Alex finally let him up for air. Alex burst into laughter, and Josh blushed before joining him. Josh couldn't remember ever being happier. He wouldn't change Alex for anything. He'd keep him just as he was, tail and all. Junebug Alien by Elizabeth Coppin. June 3rd, last year. We are not engaged, with shades of yet. A happily domesticated living together, and 1+1 pet cats, who had strictly no access to the foot of the bed. We were that late 20s, 4 years running, saving for our first home, meatless Mondays, and Italian night Thursdays brand of content. Happy was how friends spoke of us, or perhaps settled, a good match, or work well together. Frankly, if our friends were to describe their ideal relationship, they'd often call it something like Jason and Lucy. Jason enjoyed old sitcoms, filing systems, clean clothes on the floor, and the sight of books in a bookcase. I liked the feel of old paper, an overstocked kitchen, sex on all fours, and how he smelled after a warm day. We were cat people, with nothing against dogs, and we both hated rain. I brought with me the never-ending kitchen tools with functions both civic and conceptual. He contributed with the slouching, steel filing cabinet in the corner of our office. I say, with confidence, that we loved each other as best you can. September 23rd, last year. We have both smooth pro-con lists on the matter. Absolutely no plans, however, but a certain je ne sais quoi sort of affection for tax breaks and property law. Without a heavy wedding ledger, we end up eloping. Picnic lunch to follow next week. Champagne for all involved. November 8th, last year. I was 26 when my parents, who meant well, first asked, "Are you thinking about kids?" The question chased me all across work, friendly conversation, dinners out, and family reunions. Jason's mother's eyes smiling kindly, eyes furtive for grandchildren and genetic lineage. Jason's co-workers, face ripe and curious, asked when Jason was going to bread my oven, as though anybody could not catch that drift. My best friend, child-free and rootless, questioned my uterus. My brother, with his 2 slobbery toddlers and a well-behaved dog underfoot, wondered every few phone calls, and privately, I am quite sure they all meant well. Even Jason, rolled away, naked and panting, looked at me a little curiously some evenings, a little sidelong. December 12th, last year. Jason was a white-collar man with a flair for tech support. I was an alien when skinned. Whilst Jason dreamt of small pieces of every day, loose ideas of grandeur and heroism, portraits of a very, very Homo sapien soul, I dreamt in vast shadows and jeering light, sometimes of rooftops, perfect balance, but mostly of trees, branches curled like labyrinths. I am lost, and I wake far from home, skin and self. When Jason thought of children with sapling straight legs, downy hair, and soft, yielding skin, I dreamt of cubs. Not bottle-fed kittens, not meowing leopards, not deer-spotted lions. I thought of small cubs that have nothing to do with this world. I thought of 6-clawed, clumsy grace, curved-spined cubs who I'd let suckle from my wrists, who I would teach to avoid deep, poisonous water, who I would teach to speak in thrilled noises and whirls. I want nothing to do with squalling apes, including my own body, but Jason dreams of tiny versions of us with whom he can share his planet, tech support and all. He wants it as thickly and powerfully as he wants his next breath. As much as I desire, he takes it. It is such a human thing to create another human. March 30th, this year. Are you thinking about kids? No. No, 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 of course not. I think about small-furred, four-legged, spring-heeled, twist-boned aliens who are so far from alien for me. I think about showing my cubs how to bite through the throats of my cats without a meatless Monday in sight. I think about cubs who can hunt and speak languages I cannot explain. I want a spun nest of ferns. I pull up the duvet to my neck, and I want a mate biting at my throat. Jason kisses my collarbones. I want delicate carnivore cubs, and he rubs his hands and cups my stomach's curve. And I will never have this. May 16th, this year. Are you thinking about kids? Oh well, we'll see this June, won't we, Luce? June 2nd, this year. June swings around, jaunty and fresh-faced, and now we are officially trying. Trying as though I have put an ounce of effort in except for the natural push-pull of this body, this skin spit of blood and yank of hormones. There are schools of thought that hold a relationship cannot compromise in a few matters, up to and including children. My passive attitude is sure to curry resentment, they would argue. Instead, it engenders something between apathy, acceptance, and that familiar emptiness. Growing up in the wrong skin altogether makes you wonder if perhaps you are simply imagining all those innards you think you have. Something that doesn't show up on an X-ray and defies the CAT scan. I swear I am a hunched-up predator from a planet that has the Milky Way as a constellation in its skies. But I feel like an empty sack of human flesh that my husband bids to fill with something equally human. Perhaps he already has, for I love so humanly. The culture chokes me, sates me, even though I am hungry and empty and lonely for things I cannot name, not in this language. How I have been raised has left an irreversible stamp on me, like the shape of a mold on what it has made. Never mind that I am made of some synthetic rubber and not fiberglass human. It is hard to explain why I consent to my husband trying, frustrating attempts to impregnate me. It is hard to explain why I am in word, if not essence, both human and trying for a baby. For all my lack of interest in the proceedings of a reproductive system, I am expecting by August. I do not think I would have known how to object, because I am very sure that on the list of things in a relationship cannot differ on, species or sanity are both deal breakers. August 29th, this year. Somewhere in my head, the light still jeers, mocks me, tells me that I will soon look down at a fleshy, tan bundle in my arms and see nothing familiar. Somewhere in my chest, the trees tower over me, whisper that my body brings nothing fanged, nothing clawed, nothing furred, that nothing with a tight kink of tail and spine comes from me. Somewhere inside of me, the familiar alien paces back and forth through the cage of my skin, my 5 fingers, my flat face, my bipedal, and the motion makes me heartsick. I have nothing against offspring, and how I love so humanly, how I love like domesticated living together, not quite engaged, meatless Mondays and Italian night Thursdays, how I love so humanly. Are you expecting a boy or a girl? Just healthy. I'm not even hoping for human. Crossing the Line by Lynn Thorne Alder. The grocery store by the bridge had been empty for years, maybe decades, but that didn't mean it was unused or uninhabited. It was the territory of Marnie's group, her pack. The pack played in the parking lot sometimes, when the weather was good, skating down the ramps and playing at being badass. They hung out in the loading dock when the weather got colder, trading stories. They had homes, most of them, but the grocery store was the pack's territory, and the pack was Marnie's pack. But tonight, the pack was at a party across the bridge, Annie's place, and Annie's party. The bridge crossed the industrial drain that had once been a creek. Like the houses, it was a product of an earlier age. A stone footbridge, paralleling traffic bridge, thick with carvings and layered with graffiti. It marked a border. Annie and her friends lived over there. Marnie and her pack lived over here. They didn't cross often, and they didn't cross without an invitation. Normal people didn't understand. Marnie hadn't really tried to explain either. Pack was more than she could explain to them. Pack, and feral, and all those other words that were second nature to her and her pack. But there was Annie's place, and Annie's people, and there was Marnie's pack, and their parking lot. The people who mattered understood. She paced the edge of the bridge. She could go over. She'd been invited, her and her pack. Most of them have taken the invitation. Everyone knew the Magpie threw the best parties. She had the house for it. She had the booze, and everyone liked her. Marnie could go over. There was nothing stopping her. She took 3 steps onto the bridge, just getting to the middle, to the invisible line where the arc of the bridge reaches apex. She didn't want to be sitting out here, sulking, hackles up, just because... Because what? She was an alpha bitch. They were her pack. Was she scared? Who would believe that? No, she was being a bitch, being territorial, sitting here snarling at empty air. She took the next step, foot in air, hand hovering over the railing. A laugh cut through the chill air, and she nearly stumbled. Him laughing at her again. That damn coyote. He had been laughing at her since he first showed up, and now... I could take your pack from you, you know. He was perched on the far edge of the bridge, grinning at her. She could almost see that coyote superimposed on him, in the lull of his smile. They're ripe for it. Annie. The words were out of her mouth before she could stop herself. She slammed her jaw shut, wishing it was on something meaty, and not just on her words. His arm would be choice. Better yet, his throat. Ha! That twit? She couldn't keep her own pack. Flock, I suppose, if they weren't such silly little birds. She couldn't take anything you don't give her. He gestured at her, stuck on the bridge. So why are you giving her anything? It was a question worth asking, but made her bare her teeth anyway. What's it to you? Curiosity. He shrugged. Your pack was there. You weren't. You were looking? She didn't know why that mattered, but it seemed to. For me? Nah. Just for an obnoxious alpha bitches who let their packs wander. They have their own lives. It sounded weak to her ears. They have their pack to support them too. What about you? Why don't you just go back to the party? I didn't come for the party. He jumped off the railing, landing a couple feet away from her. Far too close. She showed her teeth and stepped forward. He grinned at her and stepped closer. Big bad bitch, what'll you do to me? Bite you? The world beneath her feet would not let her do what the world her soul lived in wanted. She'd have to settle for what she could do with the body she had, and snarl, and threaten. Better than letting me into your parties. Pretty lame. He yawned, big and ostentatious, like I care what the birds do. She couldn't help but laugh at him, and as she looked at his smirk, she thought maybe that's what he wanted. Annie doesn't like you either. Either. What a fun word. Meaning she doesn't like you or me, or neither you nor her like me? Both, I guess. Not very friendly. I'm not very friendly. And there was the crux of the problem, and she was snarling again, wishing this body had fangs so she could shut him up. I am not nice. I am not gentle. I am not a social creature. Ah, but you are. You're not a social butterfly, but you're a pack animal, aren't you? I am not a pack mule. Not what I said, and you know it. He sidled over so he was just on the invisible line. You have your pack. What do you have? She turned in place to watch him move. He wasn't bad looking, if you got over the fact that he was a total jerk. Well, there's your pack. Yep, a total jerk. Smirking at her again and edging over the line, she showed him her teeth. Mine. And yet I could take them from you. He held out both hands, palms up. But I don't. I won't. And I'm out here talking to you, and not in there talking them up. Because Annie won't let you in. The house has 2 doors. He shook his head. No, Marnie, I know why I am out here. The question is, why are you? That was a good question. She didn't like any of the answers. Sulking? She tried to sound offhanded about it, as if she were joking for once. The damn coyote didn't laugh. Your pack is there, because the bird has good booze and good music. She can afford those things. She rolled her shoulders. She could afford her apartment, but not the booze Annie poured all over everyone. And what are you going to do about it? What am I? She glanced up at his smile, his damnable coyote smile. Well, I guess I'm going to go over there and show teeth and take my pack back, aren't I? That would be the reasonable thing to do, if you wanted your pack. What do you get out of this? You manipulative cad, manipulative coyote cad, cute manipulative coyote cad. Well, it could be worse. Coyotes aren't magpies. Me? I get to watch some fur and feathers fly. I get to watch you laugh at the bird, and she really deserves it. And you're going to take me with you, as your date. I am? His grin only grew. Well, how else am I going to get to watch? She had to smile back. You've been laughing at me for weeks. You were sulking. Sulking is silly. So you taunted me? Well, it pissed you off, didn't it? He had moved around her, a step at a time, until her back was to Annie's, and she was facing the old grocery store, her territory. Yes, it pissed me off. She felt her back stiffen a bit. Good. Now, are you going to take me to the party? She glanced over her shoulder towards Annie's. Her pack was there, after all. She shouldn't be sitting out here in the pout. Yeah, let's do that. She tilted her head at the party. Let's see some fur and feathers fly. She glanced at him sidelong. And then maybe you can come back over the bridge with me. The Journey by Rai Skodras. The silver light of the moon blanketed everything in crisp sharpness. It wasn't soft, and each blade of grass stood out like its own separate being. But Kaleo found warmth within it. Or maybe the warmth was in his heart. From so many years ago, he felt muffled by the dark rows of trees at his side, with nothing but the sound of his own footsteps in his ears. Before him, the hill rose black and flecked with silver. Even now he could see the moon shining down over it all. The excitement rising in his chest pushed the brooding back to only a low hum. His slate eyes opened wide when he broke from the trees, and the moon cast itself upon him. It almost hurt to look at. But that was to say nothing of the joy threatening to burst the seams of his heart. It blazed before him, a perfect circle cut from the sky to release the daylight behind, but reflected, it was so much kinder than sunlight. He'd been blessed with a world with a moon, and that was about it. It shouldn't have, but somehow that same moon made him feel closer to all he had lost. It called to his pulse, every bit of him resonating before it. He fell to his knees at the wonder. The ground was cold beneath him, and Kaleo welcomed the dampness as much as he disliked it. It caused his mind to wander, but slowly. The moon was not burning above him. It did not surrender to such worldly methods. It simply was, existing as the vessel of perfect light. And Kaleo stayed with his arms spread and a smile across his face, looking up at the light and pleading with it, the kind of pleading that comes from a hope one knows is not the truth. He begged until his arms finally fell back to his sides, and then he looked at the silver-stained ground. His bangs brushed against his forehead. He was still here after all, still real. Not that being real had anything to do with it. The problem was the real ground beneath him. Slowly he got up, knees cracking under the cold, and he knew they would be grass-stained once he got home. But home wasn't really the word for it, was it? Whatever it was, he didn't want to go back just yet. He slipped his hands into the pockets of his black coat and started up the hill, a thin dirt path reaching all the way to the top. The moon shone down over his shoulder, and he kept glancing at it the way one would an adversary. Its perfect love now filled his heart with pain where it once felt joy. Another night, and here he still was. Kaleo was the only one of his kind. Here, at least. Every lone moment of the day, and even, at times, when he was with others, he knew it. He once lived in a world as tactile as this one, and felt it beneath his feet. That's how he knew it was real. But he'd been sent away, and given a moon but no home. Only a moon to tell his story to. Because worlds like his did not really exist. Not here anyway. And thus if he'd let another know of the immense loneliness, well, that'd only get him sent to a doctor, or worse yet, locked away for good. So he walked the streets under the full moon, the only one who knew his hurt, and yet still not one who was able to help. He let the droning of his footsteps drown out the swirling mess within his head. Maybe, if he didn't stop walking, the gravity of his situation would not catch him, would not push him back down to this earth. The hill and its field were behind him now, and he walked among the brick buildings of suburbia. Streetlights fought with the moon, spreading their orange haze over the concrete below, and just for a moment, he could forget the silver light following him just over his shoulder. He was never really sure where he was going, but then getting somewhere was never the point of it in the first place. He was turning down an alley where neither light seemed to reach him. At one side was the concrete wall of some sort of shopping center, and on the other a tall, bleak wall of evergreens. The sky above still glowed with a silver light, but none of it fell on these dark streets. He watched his feet walking one in front of the other for a while, until a noise made him look up. Several meters in front of him, he saw a figure, probably a girl, but he wouldn't bet his life on that assumption. A white sweater caught his eye, and he guessed it had been the sound of sneakers scuffing against the pavement that had caused him to look up. He started towards them, not really knowing why or if he would say anything, but some other force was coming up inside him, the want to know where this person was going. They saw him, and started to run, with perhaps the smallest hint of a smirk on their lips. He couldn't be sure. It was dark in the alley, and what was probably the girl had run down a path flooded with orange light, back into the mazes of suburbia. Kaleo took off in pursuit, not sure if he even wanted to catch the person, or what he would do if he did. As he broke out of the path and onto the streets, he caught sight of a dark, uneven hair bobbing ahead of him. The road gradually sloped down, and with a lazy curve in it as well. Kaleo was worried he would lose them around the bend. But then the black and orange stripes at the pylons came into view. The road was being excavated up ahead, probably for new water mains, and there was a large stretch carved out. Before the ditch stood a long wooden fence, painted in yellow and black. The pylons were placed at either end, with caution tape hanging haphazardly around them. Kaleo was hoping this would slow the person down, but as they came upon the fence, they leapt with a long and graceful stride. They landed firmly on their side and kept on running. He would have to jump too. His legs were heavier than theirs, but still he came upon the wooden beam of the fence, and he leapt upward. He actually cleared the beam, but he was already falling, and the ledge on the other side of the ditch was rising above him. The packed earth and decimated asphalt struck him hard in the chest, his chin striking the concrete as the breath was knocked out of him, and he came to rest on his back. The ditch was not deep, but it was damp and cold. Kaleo felt his head hit against the gravel beneath him, felt each grain give rise to a new welt on his skin. He lay at the bottom in stunned silence. The sound of footsteps approached, and in a moment the face of the figure appeared above. "Oh my God, are you all right?" Hearing that voice, she was definitely a girl. Kaleo could think of any number of curse words that were floating through his mind, but he did not speak any of them. Instead, he knocked his head back against the cold ground a few more times. His eyes were doing their best at focusing, and above him all he saw was the faint outline of the girl's face, the night sky and the burning moon, before he saw nothing at all. Kaleo became acutely aware of the aching in his bones and not much else. The side of his face stung. His eyes were two black holes. Jesus, why were you out chasing people in the middle of the night anyway? Without knowing if the voice had been talking to him at all, he answered, "Because I'm an alien." An alien? Not really an alien. His voice was thick and hot in his throat, as if every word he said were spoken through a washcloth. Not from another planet, another world. He tried to raise his hand to his eyes, but it fell sharply down on his nose. He wouldn't be surprised if the impact had broken it too. Again he could have cursed. Instead, he let out a shuddering sigh and lay back within the slightly swelling confines of his brain. The room had been only a hazy down before, but slowly it materialized before his eyes. They had been open all this time, he realized, though this didn't make him think of blinking. Though it was still dark, as far as he could tell the walls were painted white. It was impossible to be sure, as the only light came from a navy blue bulb that ran across the wall parallel to him. He felt the girl more than he saw her, felt her watching him from beside the bed. You must really have hit your head, or maybe you're just crazy to begin with. He was still staring at the ceiling, but could see her out of the corner of his eye, sitting on her chair backwards, leaning inquisitively towards him. His head ached. He wasn't crazy, and that sentiment battered at his consciousness harder than the concrete, pestering him until he had pushed it all back behind its wall. It was something he taught himself to do many years before. "I was chasing you because I think I was just trying to forget." His words still sounded muffled, but at least now he was more aware of what he was saying, and he sounded like a lunatic. Who the hell goes around chasing girls in the middle of the night? Whatever. I made sure you didn't die, but now I think you should probably just go home. He shook his head with great effort. "I can't go back there," he said. "There's no way." "Not your home planet, nutjob. I mean your actual house. In the real world?" She had gotten up from her chair, but he couldn't see what she was doing. She hadn't been listening at all. And yes, he had a house in this real world, but he wasn't looking forward to going back there either. He stared at the ceiling with clear eyes that still got him nowhere. "What's your name?" he asked. "What?" she replied, but he didn't repeat himself. Maybe it was a strange question coming from someone like him. "My name is Star," she answered, after some time of silence. "I'm Kaleo." The corners of his mouth lifted, and he definitely felt crazy. In a way, he was sure insanity brought a sense of reckless abandon. "Maybe you should go." Her voice urged him again, but softer this time, as if reminding an elderly person to take their medication. "What were you doing out in an alley in the middle of the night anyway?" Kaleo stayed staring up at the ceiling, the blue expanse swirling with shapes that were only a product of the dark. His words were coming out like he'd known this girl all his life. Maybe this was the true voice of insanity. Maybe she was totally right about him. I don't see how you're in the place to ask, she mumbled off, and he heard her shuffling some things in the direction of the door. But I was just clearing my head. For a moment, her voice sounded far away and wistful, but it did not last for long. Can you walk? He didn't sense a shred of concern in that question, so he lifted himself up with his arms, sitting upright in the bed for a moment and trying to discern if the swimming in his head was from the fall or this encounter. There was a white plastic computer desk across from the bed, where Star had been sitting before. Now she stood at the end of the narrow room, in front of 2 doors and a bicycle. He guessed one would have to be a closet. There was no clutter anywhere. She stared at him expectantly, her eyes wondering why he was taking his sweet time, just lounging in another person's bed. Her dark hair was tinted blue from the light, her fringe hanging low over one eye. She wore a white shirt with holes in the sleeves, and her tall black boots sewn with blue light. Kaleo lifted his legs over the side of the bed and stood. Of course he could still walk. The fall hadn't been that bad, but for some reason he had thought himself to be more gravely injured than he was. Perhaps it was the pressure building up inside his skull. Star watched him, her arms crossed and her eyes wide. You can walk, so walk out of here, she said bluntly. Clearly pretense only went so far with her. But there was no sense in stalling, and Kaleo moved towards the door, this whole experience already fading in his memory. In a few hours he would question whether it had happened at all. Later on, he probably wouldn't even care. Everything was just a blur of the past to him. Everything not really real. She opened the door for him, and he squinted against the glare from the fluorescent bulb in the hallway. He took one step outside the room, into the sudden coldness of the light, and then stopped for a moment. He had hardly even realized what he was doing, but he turned to Star before she could close the door. Do you want to walk some more? She squinted at him incredulously. With me, I mean, or just if you still needed to clear your head? The moon knew he still did. He would have walked until morning, if only that didn't mean having to see the burning sun. Finding him had probably disturbed her evening. There was no reason why adding him to her walk wouldn't just disturb it even more. Star made a sound as though she was exhaling through her teeth, although her mouth gaped open. How did she do that? She looked down and then back at him, and he just stood there stupidly expecting an answer. Sure, why not? Things have already been weird enough. She stepped out of her room, pulling her tattered sleeves down over her hands in what Kaleo was sure was an impulsive motion. But Kaleo just smiled. She closed the door behind them. The somehow warm blue light of the room shut out, trapping them in the glaring white hallway. She locked the door with a black key. I'm going for a walk with an alien, she said, more to herself than anyone else. Kaleo followed her down the hallway, smiling stupidly. That blow to the head must have really gotten to him. This must have seemed like a good idea in his near-concussed state, but now that the crisp night air had cleared his head, he was kicking himself. Star had walked ahead of him, silent for 10 minutes now? Kaleo followed with his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. Somehow Star's way of walking made her seem like she was throwing a tantrum. His breath caught in his throat. Star scuffed her boots against the damp asphalt with deliberation, which caught his attention. So why'd you pick this place to come to from your other world? She said without looking at him. Well, it's not really... It's more complicated than that. It's not like he knew what to say, not like he had told this story before. I didn't choose to go anywhere. Crash landing? She looked back with a look in her eye Kaleo couldn't read, but which seemed to make fun of him. I'm not really an alien, you know. He stopped in his tracks and glared with resentment. Finally, you admit it. She gave an exasperated sigh while stopping along with him. She must have seen the look in his eye because she added, Yeah, I know, whatever you are. It's not a matter of what I am, but where I'm from. It all seemed so simple to him now, but of course that wasn't the kind of thing people just believed from a strange man they met in an alley. Star turned away, with what might have been a roll of her eyes. Kaleo couldn't be sure in the dark, and continued walking. He followed, wanting to explain himself. The smart thing would have been to turn the other way, go walking back to the place where he lived and let himself forget about the girl. But something was tugging on his heart, pulling all the words out of his throat like they were hooked fish, and he couldn't shut up about it. It's really different from here. Of course, they were just words, and if his brain had been involved at all, it would have stopped him. He found himself rambling, without knowing what he was saying. There's no moon. I mean, there's no sun either, but I think that's why I like to go out and talk to the moon. Star slowed her pace, looking back at him over her shoulder. He continued, I don't know why I feel so close to it. I shouldn't, really, I guess, but for some reason it's the only thing that makes me feel close to home. Maybe you're from the moon, Star said, but she must have seen the sting in his eyes because her voice softened and, Sorry, she said. I think the moon just has that effect on people. She was closer now, but still only glancing back at him, maybe too afraid to connect, to get close. Her gaze was on the sky now, even though the blue glow of the moon had been drowned out by the yellow street lights. When you think about it, it's a place that's not even on Earth, and yet people have walked there. It's as far from home as we've ever been, but still, we've been there. Kaleo looked at her with some degree of incredulity, surprised that something heartfelt had come from her mouth, surprised that it actually helped to calm him. I think I might know just how that moonwalker feels, he said a little absent-mindedly. She looked back at him with a small smile. I'm still not sure if I believe you, you know, but I'll try not to make any more jokes. She'd fallen to step beside him. This place where you're from, what is it like? His heart stirred like a caged moth. His voice seemed caught now, as though his brain were trying to make up for the lapsed permission of before. Not even the moon knew this story. Nothing about it had ever passed his lips. His home world was something kept deep within the vaults of his mind. He never let it out lest someone think he was merely insane. Yet Star had asked him, and the soft tones of her voice made it seem like she actually wanted to know. It might be okay for someone else to understand his world, or at least to be privy to the secret. She expected something by now, and Kaleo felt like a lie might be more frightening than to tell the truth. After remaining silent for what must have been an absurd amount of time, he felt his voice coming out, hushed and far away, for his mind was already drifting back to the place he'd left long ago. The sky stretches over all, not with a moon or sun or stars to break its surface. Most of the time, we don't even have clouds. The sky just is, and we accept that because we know what's beyond it, other worlds on top of ours. Not this one, though. Does it rain? She asked, and he felt a pain jolt through him that was not an effect of this earlier fall. Images thundered against his mind, all damp air and cold white light, but he pushed them back behind that mental wall. His head felt hot. Sorry, what? He managed to choke out. Star had her hands clasped behind her back. You said you don't have many clouds, so does it rain at all? And how? Yeah, it rains in some places. I guess I hadn't given a thought as to how. In his heart, he knew exactly where the rain came from, but it wasn't something he was going to let himself think about. He was longing for a home, one better than this, and those memories weren't something to get nostalgic over. Ah, the mysterious ones, Star said, looking straight ahead. Never very inquisitive. We're all too busy thinking about our own mysteries, Kaleo said, though his eyes still focused on a faraway point. They were walking away from the streetlights now, down a small path surrounded by dark trees. The moon stood watch from above, but somehow none of its light fell here. Kaleo couldn't see Star's face from this position, but he could feel her smiling. He wasn't really sure if he felt in the mood for jokes, even though he just made one. He stared straight ahead at the horizon. Electrical towers stood silhouetted black against the pale navy sky, rising up as if they were something living. They had reached the structure's cold metal base before either of them spoke again. Star rubbed her arms as though she might be chilly and sat against the brush that grew around it. Kaleo paused awkwardly, unsure whether to follow suit. So it's the moon then. Star's voice shook him out of his own reality and into the real one. What? He asked, startled. That's why you come out here at night. She smirked at Kaleo's surprise. You keep gazing at it over your shoulder, like maybe you'd lose it. He looked away from her face and back up at the moon's pale silver surface, confirming her theory. It just feels like it's pulling me, he said, and quickly averted his eyes to the ground, because he knew how stupid that sounded. But Star waited for him to continue, so he did. It feels like maybe it's a doorway, like a path back. He let his voice trail off. There was no reason for that to be true, since the moon was something that didn't exist in his world, but for some reason he thought it was the answer. So you're trying to get back to your planet, or whatever? Her face wasn't as mocking as her question sounded, so he let it pass. All my life. He gave a wry smile, shoving his hands deeper into his pockets. Star glanced from him to the moon and looked like she was going to say something, but instead she lowered her face and lifted her wrist. Her features were lit by a green glow of her watch for a moment, where she abruptly got to her feet. "I've got to go," she said hurriedly. "Maybe I'll see you around again." Khalil had only opened his mouth to reply, but she was already disappearing down the path. He stood alone now on the hill, the metal towering above him and the moon offering none of its glow. He didn't understand what had just happened, but he felt like something had broken off too quickly, like a harp string snapped in the midst of a song. That's how it happened without him really noticing. In his next conscious moment, he was back on the path, moving forward with Star's dim form in the distance. He was shocked, but didn't pause. He was never going to get around this one. It was one thing to chase her to begin with, but now after everything, here he was following her again. He really should not go to her home, but his feet kept moving. Soon the gravel path turned to asphalt, then pavement as he continued, far enough behind to remain unnoticed, yet keep Star in his sight. They approached the apartment building they had left some time before, and Star swiped in a side door with some sort of card. Khalil sped up and caught it just before it closed. Star was already gone up the staircase. It was crazy what he was doing, but he let the door slip closed behind him. He followed up the stairs into the floor he remembered as hers. It wasn't the main staircase, just a side one, and it wasn't lit at night. As he got to her floor, he stopped on the threshold, hanging back in the shadows. There was a commotion in the hallway, and when his eyes finally focused, he realized it involved Star. She had her back to him, her shoulders heaving with breath from her run up the stairs. She was standing by her door, and down the hallway from her loomed a woman with dark hair and a large frame. Khalil could see the look on the woman's face, and it was not good. When her mouth opened, he had no trouble hearing what it was she had to say. "Where were you?" Her voice came out like a charring flame, and Khalil saw Star flinch. "I'm sorry, I was just walking," came her breathless reply. "You know you're not allowed to leave the apartment," the woman snapped, as though any excuse Star made would have been the wrong one. "I'm sorry, I know." Star's reply was almost too faint to hear. Khalil strained his eyes between Star and the black-haired woman. What was going on, and what should he do? "Of course you know," the woman spat, and Star flinched again. "But again you deliberately defy me." She raised a hand, and Star tensed, but it was only raised to point at the apartment door. "Now get back into your room and stay there, or I really will smack you." The woman gave a last scathing look before turning and heading up the main staircase from where she had presumably originated. Star let out a long sigh and turned to insert her key into the door. Khalil was on his way down the hallway. "Star, what was—" At the sound of his voice, she turned with wide-eyed horror, hurriedly unlocking the door in front of her. "You shouldn't be here." Khalil was quick enough to get an arm in the doorway and keep it open against her protest. Who was she? Star didn't answer the question. "Khalil, go away," she shouted, pushing his arm out of the door. "How old are you?" he asked. 19. Now leave." Successfully removing his grip, she slammed the door and he heard it lock into place before he could even process what to do next. He almost didn't catch the whisper from the other side of the door. "Meet me tomorrow at the place we first met." Khalil once again ascended the hill in the brisk midnight air. The moon kept watch over his shoulder, though not as full as the night before. The grassy field was in slightly more shadow, but his eyes were not downcast. He wasn't looking up either. His gaze fell straight ahead. Tonight he walked with a purpose towards the alley where he had first seen Star. It was true they hadn't technically met until he'd fallen into the ditch, but Khalil couldn't imagine that that was the meeting place Star was thinking of. She told him to meet her, so now he was going to get answers. He came to the top of the hill, footsteps sounding across the tarmac as he moved from silver pastures to golden streets. and he stared down the gently sloping sidewalk leading to the alley. What was he going to say to her? He'd only met Star last night, their entire encounter laced with insanity, his own insanity. Maybe she'd be waiting in there with a dozen police officers. Help me, this delusional man tried to force his way into my apartment. Maybe it was the delusion that kept him moving forward. For once, he told someone the truth, and they'd sort of believed him. Even after everything from last night, she still wanted to see him. Kaleo had to hold on to that, to believe in it, because for once he may have had something other than the moonlight to fill his nights. He rounded the corner of the alley, letting his eyes adjust to the dark. At first, he thought she wasn't there, and couldn't decide if that was better or worse than being met by the police. Then he saw a glimpse of leather boot and dark hair against the fence of the walkway she had first run down. His feet quickened, and he reached her in what seemed like a whirl. "I didn't think you would come," he breathed without thinking. "I'm the one who asked you to come here," she said, her eyes narrowing with her usual suspicious tone. "Why wouldn't I show up?" Kaleo's face grew into a small smile. "I don't know. I'm kind of weird." "Don't I know it," Star smiled back. "But after what you saw last night, I guess we're kind of even." She pushed herself off the fence and started walking to the street. Kaleo followed without her even having to ask. He was waiting for a further explanation, but Star seemed content to just walk in front of him silently. "So are we going to tell me who that was?" he asked, even though it was really none of his business. Star didn't look back, but he saw her shoulders heave in a silent sigh. "She's not really—" she trailed off, and he caught up to her as they crossed the street, heading once again towards the shadowed path. She was a picture of gold and black in the street light's glow, but her visage quickly changed to smoke when they entered the cover of the trees. "She's not really my mother, not really, if you were wondering." Kaleo couldn't say for sure if he even had been wondering. He didn't know what he thought of the woman, other than that she was a danger to Star. "She was my foster mother when I was younger," Star said, as if finally putting the truth right out there. Kaleo sensed the tension in her voice, like maybe she was lying in wait for the reaction. His reaction was to stick his hands into his pockets, giving a shrug. "But you're an adult now, aren't you?" "Well, I'm 19, so I guess so." Her teeth were set, and she picked up the pace. Kaleo furrowed his brow for a moment behind her, wondering why they seemed to be the wrong thing to say, but he quickly fell back into step beside her. "Look, I'm sorry if I was out of line. I just never been in a situation like that," he tried to explain, leaving out the fact that this was probably the largest amount of words he's spoken in months. Star's eyes averted as she began to answer. "It's not that I—" Abruptly they emerged from the trees onto the open path. What once had been in the shadows, the waning moon now touched the tips of the grass with beads of silver light. They swayed in a wayward breeze. "Hey, why don't you tell me more about your world?" She turned on her heel to face him, her face smiling now, though Kaleo could tell from her silver-touched eyes that they weren't quite committed to the new look. "What? Kaleo still wasn't used to speaking about his world, let alone letting the words out with ease. He felt everything welling up in his chest. He wanted to tell Star, which was shocking enough, but he didn't know where to start. Star's way of changing the subject had apparently worked. He thought for a moment before beginning, looking at the ground as they continued walking. "Did you know that there are trees like this in my world?" he said, gesturing back at the conifers along the edge of the wooded path. "There are?" That skepticism was back in her voice, but her facial expression remained the same. She had her hands folded behind her as they walked backwards. Kaleo didn't let her disbelief change his mood. "In the northern forest. Up there it's as silent as death. When you walk, you don't hear your own footprints. Through the buildup of needles on the forest floor, fog hangs heavy among the trunks, and that's all right, because everyone lives in the canopy anyway." He felt himself rambling and paused to take a deep breath. After years of holding it all inside, here it was spilling out like a punctured flask. Star seemed to be a little more interested now, and they were approaching the electrical tower. The forest carries on over the mountains, and nobody's really sure where it ends, or if it ends at all. "So you've been there?" she asked, her eyes alive again under the silver moonlight. "Once or twice," said Kaleo. "Do you think the forest ends?" "Everything's got to end sometime," Kaleo replied, shrugging his shoulders. They'd reached the tower, and Star took hold of one of the metal bars. swinging under it into the brush of the tower's confines. "So, where else has trees like ours?" she asked, skipping through the bushes. "The southeastern cliffs," he answered, the images flooding his mind instantly at the thought. "It's foggy there too, though not so silent. The sound of the waves carries under everything. It rains more, and the people who live in that forest run over the needled carpet on hooves, not paying the treetops any mind." He drifted off, one hand raised and placed upon the cold metal of the tower. His heart was stuck with a sudden aching, and his vision drew out until he was no longer even looking for Star amongst the branches. "Are you all right?" Her voice was soft, concerned rather than playful, and somewhere close in front of him. He pulled out of his ravine with a sniff. "Huh? Oh, yeah," but he looked up at the nearly full moon rather than at her concerned face. For a moment his eyesight was bathed in silver so bright it almost hurt. "Is it salty?" "What?" he said, looking back at her. "The ocean, by the cliffs. Is it salty?" "I don't know. I guess so. I've never tasted the water." Kaleo looked at his feet, considering. When he heard her giggle, he looked up. "You never tasted the water?" She laughed again. "You know, most people here know that the sea is salt water without ever having to taste it." "It never really came up," he said defensively, but his heart wasn't in the indignation. He couldn't help but smile back at Star. "I'll let you off with that answer for now, but if you eventually make it back, you'll have to taste it for me." "Deal," he said, happiness stirring in his heart. As they continued meeting at night in the darkened alley and walking up towards the tower as if it were now their own special place, neither of them spoke any agreement on that, but somehow their feet always pointed in the same direction. Star went on dodging his questions about her home situation, replacing them instead with questions about his own world. He'd breathlessly tell her stories about mountains and coastlines and warm rain, and he continued making absurd promises to her about drinking water and tasting dust. Kaleo couldn't tell if Star really believed in the existence of his world, but one thing she did have faith in was that he would one day get back there. Sometimes it felt like she had more faith in that idea than he did, though he really didn't notice. He looked at the moon less and less as the nights went on. If Star had caught on, she didn't mention it either. One night he rounded the corner as usual, his pace fast, and with a hint of a smile on his lips, only to find the small pathway empty. The jarring sight stopped him for a moment, then furrowing his brow, he walked over and checked around the fence. There was no sign of Star. Every other night, she had been there without fail, always at the same time. Each night she left him with a promise to meet back at the same location. Last night had been no exception. So where was she? His mind wandered back to the woman he'd seen when he followed Star home. Even though she was apparently not allowed to leave her apartment at night, she had obviously been meeting him anyway. Had she gotten caught this time? He suddenly realized he was already heading toward Star's building, lost in his thoughts. He'd been blind once again to his own body's movement. Ignoring how worrying that was, he pressed onward with new intent. If Star was missing, he had to find her. When he came upon the looming building, a darkened monolith in the night, he realized his problem. How was he going to get inside? He didn't have a key card. Even though a building like this was bound to have a security buzzer, the only person he knew was Star, and he hadn't even bothered to learn her apartment number. His plan was not very well thought out. The windows loomed over him, spewing a cold light. He cursed silently, but then the light bathed over him, brighter than before, and he looked towards its source. Someone had opened the building's front door, leaving it swinging open behind them as they walked away. Kaleo spurred into action and ran towards the door. He was just fast enough to slip in before it closed, and the metal lock slid into place. He breathed a sigh of relief. Now to find Star's room. He knew her floor number at least, so once he located the outer stairway, he might as well stick to what he was used to. He hurried up the 5 flights, oblivious to the heaving of his own breath. When at last he stood in the fluorescent hallway, he could pick out Star's door right away. He found the hallway entirely deserted and walked forward, giving the wood 2 knocks. He waited for a minute, holding his breath. Then the door opened, and Star's face peered out through the crack. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Kaleo? What are you doing here?" She asked in what was probably supposed to be a whisper. "You weren't at our meeting place." He looked away as he spoke. suddenly not entirely convinced she'd be happy to see him. The past few nights with her had momentarily blinded him to how strange this all might seem. "Just because I don't show up doesn't mean you should come here," she hissed, sticking her head out and peering up and down the hallway. "Well, come inside quickly, before anyone notices you." She opened the door just wide enough to pull Kaleo into the cramped room. Dumbfounded, he didn't put up much of a fight. Star closed and locked the door behind him, and let out a sigh. Kaleo couldn't decide if it was relieved or exasperated. "I'm sorry, I just..." Star held up a hand to stop him, and with another rubbed her forehead. "Don't make it any more weird than it already is. You've already been in here, and you didn't apologize then." She was as straightforward as usual, and Kaleo felt the anxiety flowing out of him. The same dark blue light glowed over the white desk in the corner, and it still made the room feel warm. Star gestured over to the bed. "You might as well have a seat. I don't see why we can't stay in tonight." She gave a tiny ghost of a smile, and Kaleo thought it probably was alright that he'd come after all. He walked over and perched at the head of the bed, leaning back against the wall. Star sat on the chair at the desk. "Why didn't you meet me?" Kaleo asked, willing himself not to look in her direction. "She was walking around earlier, so I couldn't risk it." Her voice had a weak quality to it, as if she could guess Kaleo's response to the excuse. He kept quiet. They stayed in deep blue silence for a while, before Star pulled her legs up onto the chair and said, "Do you think it's possible for other people to cross over into your world?" Kaleo was taken back, so he sat up straight. After a while, he looked back at Star. "To be honest, I don't think it would even be easy for me. So for someone else who's never been there..." He trailed off. "Not that I'd be welcome back there myself," he thought. "I thought so," she said, looking down. In the dim lighting, Kaleo couldn't quite make out the expression on her face. He opened his mouth to ask, but was interrupted by a knock on the door. Star bolted to attention. First looking at the door, and then looking at Kaleo sitting on the bed. "Get against the wall," she hissed, and he pressed himself into the far side of the bed. From this vantage point, he could just see around the bulkhead of the closet. He hoped if his dark clothing, any exposed part of him would blend right into the background. Star had gotten up, and she breathlessly pulled the door open. Even though it was only part way, Kaleo squinted in the light. Star's whole body stood rigid, so he didn't have to see the figure behind the door to know who it was. "Why did you open your door?" The woman's harsh voice sounded from around the corner. "What? Because you knocked. Don't play stupid." She cut off Star's response. "I heard you open it earlier. Why? Were you thinking of sneaking out?" Kaleo didn't think she could have possibly heard the door, since she apparently lived on a different floor of the building. Perhaps it was only the sheer strength of her paranoia. Perhaps it was just a lucky guess. "No, I thought I heard something in the hallway." It was strange to hear Star's normally outspoken voice turn quiet and weak. She was like a blade of grass bending in the wind. "You're lying," her foster mother said. "I knew I couldn't trust you." Star only flinched at her words, but then the woman ordered, "Give me the key." Star's eyes widened in alarm. "Why?" A different note came into her voice. "Please, no." It was a sound of desperation. "I can't trust that you won't leave your room, so I need to check on you. Give it to me." Her demands must have seemed perfectly reasonable to herself. Star stood there silently for a moment, and Kaleo could see her eyes glittering in the cold light from the hallway. Then she slowly pulled out her key, dull black even in the white light, and handed it through the doorway. She seemed to recoil as though part of her own body had been taken away. "I wish I could trust you more, so that I wouldn't have to do this." The woman's voice had an edge of satisfaction to it. "Now you be a good girl and stay inside." "Yes, ma'am," Star said, defeated. Her eyes looked at the floor as she slowly closed the door. Kaleo almost couldn't wait long enough to be sure the woman had gone back to her own home. He jumped off the bed and took the few steps across the tiny room towards Star. Without thinking, he took her by the shoulders. "Star, are you all right?" "Yeah," she said, even though she didn't look all right at all. "Let's get out of here, okay?" Star shook her head vigorously. "I can't. She took my key." "Why does that matter?" he asked. "You can still get out of your room without a key. She wouldn't even know you were gone." "If I didn't lock the door when I left, she'd come in and take stuff." Kaleo looked around the room. Even in the dim light, he could see that it was as sparse as when he'd first been here. There was a pen holder on the desk, but no other personal touch he could see. "What do you have for her to take?" he asked, looking back at Star. Star seemed to have noticed him looking around. "My bike," she answered. It was true. It was the only unnecessary thing in the room. Kaleo smiled at the thought of it being such a simple thing that meant so much to her. "You know, you could take it with you. I understand it's a mode of transportation." Star laughed and gave him a playful hit on the shoulder. "What do you say? We can take your bike, and you can leave her far behind. I know I'm kind of spacey, but I think I'm easier to get along with than she is." Star's smile looked patronizing now. "Where are we going to go? Back to your world?" Kaleo didn't know how to respond. "Or am I supposed to go back to your place with you?" He should have been thinking of a plan, of what they would actually do, but the wheels in his head didn't even attempt to spin. He didn't want a plan. He simply wanted Star behind him instead of in this small room. "We'll figure something out," he said, not meeting her eye. He only heard her sigh, bitter and weary. "Not tonight, Kaleo." He looked back to see her shaking her head. "I'm tired. I don't want to think about this." Kaleo lowered his hands to his sides. A part of him was welling up, saying he would have been better off never following this girl. He should focus on looking for a way back to his world, something he was used to. Attachments here only go wrong since he was never supposed to fit in here in the first place. Except he wanted to believe in something different, so he ignored those things and took a deep breath. He lifted his face once again with a smile. "So tomorrow night then," he said. "What?" "Tomorrow night I'll meet you here. You can take your bike, and we'll figure out where to go from here." "Kaleo, I didn't really think—" He had already opened the door and slipped out into the hallway. From a few steps away he heard the lock click into place. His heart was doing something strange, and that really didn't feel as good as fluttering. But by all rights, their conversation should have been the most terrifying experience of his life. In this world, at least. But he'd built a wall against those thoughts, and for now he was confident in his idea. He didn't even consider that the following night could go badly. The air was cold, and Kaleo could see his breath. He raised his eyes to the sky, and they drank in the light from the silver moon. He wondered if its powers could bring luck to something like this, though he really didn't feel like he needed it. Why would Star want to stay behind in that place anyway? The grass crunched under his footsteps, stiffened by early autumn frost. It seemed like the best kind of night for beginnings. The best kind of night to sit and talk with Star without her suddenly having to run off. Kaleo's steps were lively as he left the field and started across the pavement. He hadn't been so excited in this lifetime. The light leaking out of Star's window made a halo around it in the cold air. When he had left the night before, Kaleo had wedged a small piece of cardboard in the building's side entrance, and he was glad to find it was still there. He couldn't rely on someone else leaving the building exactly as he was arriving, and he had been trying to ignore the feeling that if he buzzed up to Star, she wouldn't have let him in. When he slipped inside, he found it was much warmer in the stairwell. He took the stairs 2 at a time. Star's hallway stood long and empty before him. She was behind one of these doors, either willing to come along with him or ready to refuse. If he thought about the latter, he couldn't will himself forward, so instead he pretended the option didn't exist. He made his way to her door and knocked twice like he had last night. It opened almost immediately, and she stared out at him. He was about to say something, but she pulled him inside instead. He blinked at the shift from the bright hallway to the dark room with his eyes eventually adjusted. Star was wearing her boots, and you could see a packed backpack on the bed. Her own shadowed face looked unsure. "Kaleo, sneaking out is one thing," she started, only glancing at him for a moment. "But I have never actually spent a night away from home. What could she possibly do to you once you're gone?" he asked her, and she only gave a shrug without meeting his eye. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "Will you miss this place after you leave?" His voice was softer this time. She shook her head. "Of course not. What is there to miss?" "Exactly," Kaleo said. "When a place is your home, there's all sorts of things you miss about it when you can't go back. But if this place isn't your home, I don't know. I think it would be better to go find a place that you actually would miss." Star looked at him and smiled. She didn't answer with more than a nod of her head, though she did step past him to grab her bike by the handles. Kaleo walked to the bed and slung her light canvas bag over his shoulder. It must not have had much in it. He walked back as she was reaching for the doorknob, her bike beside her. The door was flung open before she could reach it. Kaleo reflectively ducked behind the closet as the white light flooded in from the hallway, but he stepped forward enough so that he could see Star, and the woman could probably see him too. Star just stood staring at the face of her foster mother. Her hands gripped the textured handle of the bike, knuckles turning white. "What do you think you're doing?" The woman's voice was a growl and a hiss all rolled into one. Star cringed from it, frozen without anything to say. "Just keep going, Star," Kaleo said from the background, louder than a whisper. He didn't know why he was hiding, didn't know why he didn't step in. Here he was in the shadows while Star stood against the blinding light. The woman might have flicked her eyes over at him for the briefest of moments, but Kaleo felt his chest seize up anyway. Her attention was back on Star now. "You will not leave the house tonight." It sounded more like a spell than an order. Star looked away, back into the room, but not at Kaleo, and he saw her grip release just the slightest bit on the handles of the bicycle. "Don't listen to her. You know you can just keep going. You can leave." And what could she do about it? His voice was pleading, and ever so slightly confused. Still, he didn't push the woman out of the way, didn't send the black-haired tyrant spiraling to the white linoleum of the hallway. Star had a wall up, an energy that stopped him, like maybe she wouldn't see him again if he did. It wouldn't have mattered, because if she didn't come with him now, the chances of her being able to see him again were practically non-existent anyway. She'd blink out of his life just as soon as she had arrived. And she was something he would miss. Star stood tense, her eyes still averted as the woman stared at her. When her tension finally broke, she wheeled her bike backward, ever so slightly, away from the door. "Star, don't you dare!" Kaleo couldn't even remember the last time he'd raised his voice, so the sound was foreign to him. He stepped out of his hiding spot, still holding the bag over his shoulder, and he saw Star throw a glance in his direction, but he could tell her eyes hadn't focused on him. She'd been so keen to run away to his world with him, until he told her it probably wouldn't happen, and he'd been so ready to take whatever answer the moon offered him, keeping too much locked behind the walls in his mind, not allowing the truth to really hit him. So many yearnings based on lies, on promises that couldn't be kept. His walls wouldn't help him anymore, and the moon's cold light didn't keep him warm, so he did the last thing he could think of doing. "Star, don't you stay here. Do you want to know the truth about my world? My world is dark and cold, and all that comes from the sky is rain. I ran away, to the world I told you about, a place I was never welcome in." Her eyes were on him now, etched with a focus so sharp it almost hurt. But Kaleo kept going, feeling the words pour out of him. "I was exiled from there. I didn't fit in there just like I don't here, and I couldn't go back there even if I tried, but I—" He was choked by a sudden lump in his throat. He forced himself to go on through it. "I never cared about anything in this world, and I never found anything that made it better than the rainy land where I was born. I had nothing that made me want to stay. Until you." He was breathing heavily and felt tears streaming down his cheeks. What else could he say? "Please come with me, Star. We can both discover everything in this world together." He would never get to drink water from the Southern Ocean, and he'd never get to taste the dust of the Western lands. But he'd heard this world had places where the sand was red, the ocean so salty you could float on them. Maybe, just maybe, if Star left this apartment tonight, they could see them together. He noticed there were tears in her eyes as well, as she pulled them away from Viz. The woman in the hallway stared with a dumbfounded, enraged expression on her face. Star faced forward again, renewing her grip on the bicycle, and took a stiff step forward. There was the Star Kaleo was used to. Her next step was more forceful, and though the woman tried to hold her, Star forced the bike past, knocking her back against the far wall. Kaleo was on Star's heels, hurrying out of the apartment, down the hallway. She could always walk pretty fast, and finally catching up to her side just as they neared the stairway. Neither of them even bothered to turn back. Star hefted the bike up as they descended, and she didn't look at Kaleo. "Your world, was any of it true then? Or did you just make it up?" "It's true, Star. I didn't tell you about where I was born because, let's face it, it's crappy, and I didn't want you to think about it, but those wonders, those all exist." In the stairway, the orange streetlights trickled in, and it felt warm even though they were cramped together. "But I can't go back there, Star. It was useless holding on to the idea for so long. It was kind of useless for me to be listening to her for so long, too. So you're forgiven, she smiled. She set the bike down, and they reached the ground floor, and they both stepped out into the chilly night air. This world can be a good one, he said. Reaching out beside him, Star took his hand. It can be. I believe you. Thank you so much for listening along. If you like this book and you want to check it out for yourselves, we will have some information for you in the description. We hope you have a great day and a great rest of your con.